The first thing he felt was pain. Not a dull ache, nor a nagging ache. It was sharp, as if someone had driven a rusty nail into every vertebra and twisted it. Dan Hawk opened his eyes and saw mud. Wet, black mud 3 centimeters from his face. It smelled of manure and smoke. Someone was screaming. Many people were screaming at once. He tried to stand up and realized he was lying face down on the ground. His knees wouldn't obey him. His back was on fire. The body felt like someone else's, skinny, light, weak. He clenched his fingers and felt the mud caked under his nails. These fingers were thinner than his own. These hands didn't know a keyboard. These hands knew only a shovel and beatings. He understood this immediately, not with logic, with his skin. The body remembered what the mind hadn't yet accepted. He'd been beaten. He'd been beaten often. He'd been beaten for a long time. Someone grabbed him by the collar and yanked him upward. The world swayed. A square, small, about 40 people around. Wooden houses, mud instead of pavement. The sky was gray and low. The Middle Ages, or something like the Middle Ages, but worse.
Standing before him was a broad man with a red face and a beard caked with crumbs. His eyes were small, angry, greedy. The village headman. Dan didn't know where that word came from, but it came. His body remembered. The village headman, Gregor Molt, the man who ruled this village as if it were his own barn. The village headman spat. The spit landed on Dan's cheek. The crowd laughed. Gregor flung something into the mud in front of him. 3 scrolls, yellow, crumpled, tied with a red rope. Marriage scrolls. Dan knew it. His body knew it. Gregor said Dan had a choice. He would take these 3 into his home, or he would burn with them at dawn. There was no third option. Dan looked up. Behind the village head stood 3 girls. Their hands were bound with rope behind their backs, dirty, thin, barefoot. The first one's hair was as white as snow. Her face was hidden by a hood. Her back was straight. She stood as if the ropes around her wrists were merely an annoying formality rather than a humiliation. The second one was slightly shorter. Her eyes were covered with a silver film. Blind, or not entirely blind. She looked straight at him through the film and tilted her head slightly, as if studying something invisible. The third was very young. A brand was seared into her cheek. A single word. Shadow. She stood barefoot in a puddle and was trembling, not from the cold, but from rage. Her eyes were wild, frantic, like those of a trapped beast that had already decided that if anyone touched it, it would sink its teeth in. The crowd was screaming, "Burn them! Burn the damned!" Someone threw a rock. The rock hit the youngest in the shoulder. She didn't flinch. She just clenched her teeth. A quiet clink sounded in Dan's head. Not a sound, a sensation, as if someone had pressed enter after a long load time. A line unfolded before his eyes. He didn't see it with his eyes. He saw it somewhere inside his skull, right on the back wall of his consciousness. Triple seal system detected. 3 fragments within a 4-meter radius. Carrier status. Empty seal. Classification: Master Key. Accept rejection of all 3. Yes, no. Dan blinked. The line didn't disappear. He looked down at his chest. Beneath his torn shirt, a white circle glowed on his skin. Empty. No pattern. No lines. Just a circle. The mark of a beggar. The mark of a coward. The mark of a nobody. He looked at the 3 girls, at their bound hands, at the stone at the youngest girl's feet, at the spit on his own cheek. He looked at the village elder. Gregor was smirking. He was sure Dan would refuse, that Dan would beg, that Dan would fall to his knees and plead for mercy, just as he had done dozens of times before. Dan bent down. He picked up the scrolls from the mud, all 3 of them.
Mud on his fingers, mud on the parchment, mud everywhere. He said he'd take all three. The square fell silent. Gregor stopped smirking. The white-haired girl raised her head. The silver-eyed girl held her breath. For the first time, the youngest looked at him not as an enemy, but as a madman. Dan wiped the spit from his cheek with the back of his hand. A ringing sound echoed in his head again. System activated. Keymaster online. 30 days until the Festival of Purification. The countdown has begun. 30 days. He didn't know this world. He didn't know its rules. He didn't fully know its language. But he knew one thing. He'd been given 3 keys in 30 days. And whoever gave him those keys didn't even realize what they'd done. In his world, such negligence would get you fired. Here, they were given a wife for it. 3 of them. Gregor barked at the crowd to disperse. The festival was a month away. 4 would be burned. There was no need to rush. He waved his hand, and a soldier cut the ropes binding the sisters' wrists. Not out of mercy, out of contempt. Why tie up the dead? The eldest rubbed her wrists. Red furrows remained on her skin. She didn't look at Dan. She looked at her sisters. She checked. Both were unharmed. Only then did she turn to him. Her eyes were cold, gray, like a winter sky before a storm. She said that if he so much as touched one of them, she'd kill him in his sleep. Dan nodded. He said that was fair. He said there was only one bed in the barn and they'd take it. He'd lie by the door, with his back to them. The oldest one blinked. She was expecting anything, threats, demands, conditions. Not this. The middle one touched the oldest one on the elbow, quietly, barely noticeably, and said something strange. She said he didn't have a line. The oldest one frowned. The youngest one stopped trembling and stared at Dan.
The middle one repeated herself. She said she could see the line of death in every person in this square. For the village elder, it was short and jagged. For the soldier, it stretched out for another 20 years. For the baker across the street, it ended in winter. But Dan had no line. Just emptiness, as if he didn't exist, or as if the world hadn't yet decided what to do with him. Dan looked at her. The silver film over her eyes glinted in the gray light. She wasn't blind. She saw something no one else could see. He said they'd figure it out later. For now, they had to get off the square before the crowd started throwing stones again. The younger one hissed. She said she wouldn't go anywhere with him. She said all men were the same. She said she'd rather burn than live in a house with a stranger. The older one put her hand on her shoulder. Not gently, firmly, like a grip that says, "Shut up, I'll handle this." The younger sister fell silent, but her eyes were burning. Something stirred in the shadows at her feet. Dan noticed it out of the corner of his eye. The shadow was irregular. It wasn't moving the way a shadow should move. It was moving on its own.
The system highlighted a line. Shadow fragment detected. Host, Noel Vesper, age 17. Confidence level 3 out of 100. 3 out of 100. Dan looked at the older sister. Luck fragment detected. Carrier, Lyra Vesper, age 22. Confidence level 5 out of 100. He looked at the middle one. A fragment of foresight detected. Carrier, Murray Vesper, age 20. Confidence level 12 out of 100. 12. The highest, because she had already told him the truth about his line of death. She had already entrusted him with a piece of her secret. Not on purpose, out of habit. She was used to saying what she saw, and used to people not believing her. Dan walked toward the barn on the edge of the village. Without looking back, the 3 sisters stood in the square and watched his back. He hadn't called them. He hadn't asked. He hadn't ordered them. He just walked. 30 seconds later he heard footsteps. First, one pair. Murray. Then a second. Lyra. Then a third. Heavy. Angry. Bare feet in the mud. Noel. They weren't following him because they trusted him. They were following him because they had nowhere else to go.
The shed turned out to be worse than he'd thought. 4 walls made of rotten planks, a roof full of holes, 1 bed, a mattress stuffed with straw, a table, 2 chairs, a bucket of water. Dan stopped at the threshold and let them go ahead of him. Lyra went in first. She scanned every corner. She checked the window. She checked the back wall. She found a crack and plugged it with a rag. Murray entered quietly. She sat down on the bed. She folded her hands in her lap. Noel entered last. She pressed herself against the wall by the door. She didn't sit down. She stood there, ready to run. Dan took off his torn jacket and threw it on the floor by the door. He lay down, his back to them, facing the door. He said the door would stay closed all night. If anyone came, he'd be the first to hear them. If they wanted to leave in the morning, he wouldn't stop them. But the scrolls were signed, and as long as the scrolls were in effect, they wouldn't be burned without a trial. That was the only thing he could give them right now. Time, 30 days. Lyra stood over him. He could feel her gaze on the back of his neck. She was holding something in her hand. A knife. He knew it was a knife.
His body knew. Dan Hawk, who was beaten every day, could distinguish the sound of a knife being drawn. Dan didn't move, didn't turn around, didn't tense up. He closed his eyes. A minute later, Lyra walked away. He heard her lie down on the bed next to the sisters. She didn't put the knife away. She placed it under the pillow. The system noted it. +2 to the trust score for each of the three. Overall level: Lyra, 7. Mireille, 14. Noelle, 5. The first night of 30. 29 to go. Behind the barn wall, the wind flapped a wet rag on a clothesline. A dog barked somewhere. Dan lay on the cold floor and peered through the crack under the door. A strip of gray light. Mud. A world he didn't know. A body that didn't belong to him. 3 girls who wanted to kill him. 30 days until the bonfire. And a system that demanded the one thing he'd never learned to do in the 26 years of his past life: to trust. He smirked. The universe definitely had a sense of humor. In the morning, the cold woke him up. A gray dawn was seeping through the cracks in the walls. The sisters were asleep, all 3 in one bed. Lyra on the edge, her hand under the pillow. Mireille in the center. Their breathing was steady. Noelle was curled up in a ball against the wall. So small. Something was stirring in the shadows under the bed. Dan got up quietly. Every joint creaked. Dan Hawk's body didn't know what normal sleep was. It knew only the cold floor and beatings. He stepped out onto the threshold. The village was waking up. Smoke from the chimneys, a rooster's crow, the creak of a wagon. A dead crow lay on the threshold. Its throat had been slit. A strip of cloth was tied to its paw. One word was written on the cloth: burn. Dan picked up the crow. He looked at it. He looked at the village. One of his neighbors was watching from behind a fence. He didn't know who had left the message. It could have been anyone. The village headman, a soldier, any one of the 40 people in the square yesterday. He placed the crow behind the barn, he in the stove. Dan stood by the stove and tried to get a fire going. His hands remembered how. Dan Hawk's body had done this every morning for 3 years straight. Kindling, straw, a flint, a spark. The smoke rose crooked and acrid, but the flame caught. He set his only pot on the stove, water from a bucket. He found a sack of grain in the corner. At the bottom, 4 handfuls, nothing else. No bread, no meat, no salt. Dan Hawk had lived on scraps for 3 years and kept no supplies because they were taken from him every time they were found. He cooked the porridge, watery, tasteless. He divided it into 4 equal portions. 3 wooden bowls were on the shelf. The 4th was missing. He poured his portion into a chipped mug. He set the 3 bowls on the table. He sat down on the floor by the stove. He waited. Lyra woke up first. He heard her sit up in bed. He heard her hand slip under the pillow. The knife was still there. Only then did she open her eyes. She looked around the shed. She saw Dan on the floor by the stove. She saw the 3 bowls on the table. Her expression didn't change. No surprise, no gratitude, no suspicion, an icy mask. She woke her sisters, quietly, with a single touch. Mireille sat up immediately. Noelle flinched and hit Lyra's hand. A reflex. Lyra didn't flinch. She was used to it. They sat down at the table. All 3 bowls were in front of them. Noelle stared at the porridge. She didn't eat. She looked at Dan, then at the porridge, then at Dan again. She thought the porridge was poisoned. She's 17 years old. 4 years ago, someone slipped poison into her mother's food. Since then, she hasn't eaten food from anyone else's hands. The system highlighted the data. Noelle's trust threshold is 10. She accepts food without checking for poison. Current level, 5. Still far from the threshold. Lyra picked up a spoon. She scooped some porridge from Noelle's bowl. She ate it. She waited 10 seconds. She looked at the younger girl. Everything was fine. Noelle began to eat. Quickly, hungrily, like a starving beast. She hadn't eaten properly in 3 days. Mireille ate slowly, carefully. A silvery film on her eyes glinted in the light of the stove. She held the spoon as if it were a surgical instrument. Precise movements, not a single unnecessary one. Dan drank his portion from a mug. The porridge was disgusting, water with a hint of grain. But Dan Hawk's body was used to worse. Lyra finished first. She set down her bowl. She looked at Dan. She asked why he had agreed. Dan answered honestly. He said he had no choice. But even if he had, he would have agreed anyway. Because 3 keys in the wrong hands meant 3 vulnerabilities.
And 3 keys in a single system meant security. Lyra didn't understand. She decided he was speaking some ancient dialect. Myre tilted her head slightly. She said he spoke strangely, not like a peasant, not like a farmhand, like someone who is used to explaining complex things in simple words. Dan said he'd had a different life, a long time ago. He didn't go into further detail. Noelle licked the bowl clean, literally, with her tongue. Then she set it on the table and looked at Dan. She said the porridge was lousy, but she ate it. And she didn't die. And that's already better than yesterday. The system noted it. +1 to Noelle's trust rating, current level 6. 4 points to go until 10. Dan stood up. He had 29 days left, and his list of problems was longer than his arm. Problem number 1, the marriage certificate. Village head Gregor had retroactively entered their marriage into the church registry. Dan realized this at night while lying on the floor, unable to sleep. Dan Hawk's body how the church registry worked. The farmhand brought the documents to the village head every month. He had seen the entries. He knew the format. The date Gregor had entered in the register was a week before the Inquisitor's arrival. But according to Veldgard law, a marriage becomes valid only after a shared meal in the presence of witnesses. If no such meal had taken place before the date in the register, then the document was forged. And forging a church document is a criminal offense. Gregor had set Dan. Gregor had set himself up. He just didn't know it. Dan walked out of the barn. The village went about its business. Peasants worked in the fields. Women did laundry by the well. Children ran along the road. No one looked at the barn. It was as if it didn't exist. As if the 4 condemned men inside were no longer human. Dan walked to the bakery. The baker was Olaf Finn. He was fat, red hands, flour in his beard. He didn't like the village headman. Gregor had imposed a triple tax on flour 2 years ago, and Olaf had barely been making ends meet ever since. Dan walked into the bakery. Olaf saw him and grimaced. He didn't want to talk to a dead man. The people in this village already considered Dan dead. They don't sell bread to the dead. Dan said he needed 4 loaves. Olaf said the dead had no money. Dan said he wasn't dead. He was a man of 3 seals, and his marriage was recorded in the church registry. Olaf fell silent. That was important. In Veldgard, a family of 4 seals had more rights than a lone baker, even if those seals were cursed, even if that family was going to be burned in a month's time. As long as the document was in the registry, they were legally superior. Dan proposed a deal. 4 loaves on credit. In exchange, he'd fix Olaf's oven. Dan had seen it when he walked in, a crack in the back wall. Heat was escaping. Firewood consumption was twice the normal rate. Olaf was burning money every day. Dan Hawk didn't know how to fix stoves, but Daniel Crow knew how to solve problems. A crack in a stove isn't magic, it's clay and physics. Olaf looked at him for a long time, then he nodded. 4 loaves. Dan took the bread and headed for the square. On the way, he stopped by the village clerk's house. Bervin Stagg, a drunk. His eyes were always bloodshot. His hands shook from the moment he woke up. But his signature was legally binding because Bervin was the only literate person in the village besides the village elder.
Bervin was sitting on the porch of his house, drinking something murky from a clay bottle. Dan said he needed a witness. Bervin said he just wanted to be left alone. Dan said that if Bervin signed 1 document, Dan would tell him something interesting about the village headman. Bervin looked up. He hated Gregor. Everyone in the village hated Gregor. But Bervin hated him especially because Gregor forced him every week to sign fake reports for the church. Bervin knew that someday he, and not the village headman, would be hanged for it. He stood up. Dan set up a table in the square, a wooden crate from behind the shed. He placed 4 rolls on the crate. Lyra stood 10 paces away and watched. She didn't understand what he was doing. Dan called her over. He called Mireille and Noel. They came out of the shed. Noel was barefoot. Mireille held onto the wall. Lyra walked ahead, like a shield. Dan explained. In Veldgard, a marriage between seal-bearers is activated by their first shared meal in the presence of witnesses. The scrolls are merely an intention. The meal is the fact.
If they eat the bread right now, in the square, in the presence of a witness, and the scribe signs the document, their marriage will become legally indisputable, which means the date Gregor entered in the registry would be false, because the meal took place today, not a week ago, and Gregor would catch himself in his own trap. Lyra looked at him. For the first time in a day, there was something other than ice in her eyes. Interest, cautious, like a match flame in the wind. She asked why he needed this. Dan said he needed 30 days. 30 days without a fire. 30 days during which no one has the right to touch any of them. 30 days isn't salvation, it's time. And time is the only resource he can secure right now. Lyra sat down behind the crate. Mireille sat down next to her. Noel stood there, watching. Lyra told her to sit down. Noel hissed that she wasn't going to eat bread with a stranger in full view of the people who had thrown stones at her yesterday. Lyra repeated it. Sit down. One word. Her voice was steady, steely. Noel sat down. Bervin stood nearby. His eyes were red. His hands were shaking. But he was more sober than usual. He sensed that something important was happening. Dan broke the bread. 4 pieces. He gave 1 to each sister. He took his own. They ate in silence. In the square, in front of witnesses, a few peasants stopped to watch. Someone snorted. Someone tapped their finger against their temple. A dead man eating bread with 3 witches. What a spectacle. Bervin took out a piece of paper. His hands were shaking, but his handwriting was clear. A clerk is a clerk. He wrote down the date. He wrote down the names. He recorded the fact of their shared meal. He signed it. He affixed his seal. Dan took the document. Mireille suddenly said that someone was watching them. Not peasants. Someone from the village headman's house. A window on the 2nd floor. Dan didn't turn around. He knew Gregor was watching. So be it. By morning, he'd discover that his own document in the registry was now evidence against him. Forgery of a church record. The minimum punishment, a fine. The maximum, confiscation of property. Gregor is greedy. He'd rather cut off his own hand than lose his property, which means he won't go near the hawk house for the next few days. He'll be thinking, looking for a way out, wasting time. Time that Dan had just bought with 4 loaves of bread. The system took note. +3 to the trust score for all 3 of them. Lyra, 10. Mireille, 17. Noel, 8. Lyra has 10. The threshold has been crossed. He'll stop sleeping with a knife under his pillow. He looked at her. She didn't know that the system had recorded it. She didn't know that the numbers in his head were changing with every decision she made. She had simply eaten bread with a man who had put himself on the line to protect 3 strangers. And something inside her shifted. By a millimeter. Combined seal activated. A fragment of luck plus a master key. Level 1. Effect. A 15% increase in the probability of a favorable outcome within a 10-meter radius of the carrier. Limitation. Probability debt accumulates. Dan felt it. A faint warmth on his chest. The empty circle on his skin twitched. A single thin line appeared inside. The first thread. Of 3. They returned to the barn. Dan repaired Olaf's stove that same day. Clay from the stream bank. Water. Straw for reinforcement. 2 hours of work. The stove held the heat evenly. Olaf watched him and couldn't understand how a farmhand knew how to repair stoves. Dan didn't explain. Olaf gave him 2 more rolls. Not on credit, just like that. The first act of kindness in 3 years in this body. That evening, Dan sat by the stove. The sisters were on the bed. Noel was curled up in a ball. Mireille sat upright with her eyes closed. Lyra was sharpening a knife, but not under her pillow anymore. On the table, out in the open, like a tool, not like a weapon. The system took note. Dan stared into the fire. 28 days. The first move had been made. The village headman had been neutralized for the time being. They had bread. The agreement had been signed. Trust was growing. Slowly. Drop by drop. But it was growing. In his head, he was making a list. Problems that needed solving. Food. They wouldn't last a week on just grains. They needed a stable source. Security. The barn wouldn't withstand a serious attack. They needed walls, or allies, or both. Information. He didn't know this world, didn't fully understand its laws, didn't know the balance of power. His body remembered fragments, but the body of a farmhand knew only beatings and work. The Inquisitor.
Valerius Thorn. In 28 days, he'll arrive here, and he won't come alone. 4 problems, 0 solutions. For now. Dan lay down on the floor, with his back to the sisters, facing the door, just like yesterday. Noelle said something quietly. He didn't catch it. Myrae repeated it for her. She said Noelle had asked if he would cook porridge tomorrow. Dan said he would, if he could find the ingredients. Noelle didn't answer. But a minute later, he heard her breathing evenly and deeply. She had fallen asleep. The 3rd day began with a scream. Noelle was screaming in her sleep, not with words, just a sound, high-pitched, ragged, as if someone were pulling her voice out with pliers. Lyra jumped up instantly, knife in hand, out of habit. Myrae grabbed Noelle by the shoulders. The younger girl was twitching, eyes closed, mouth open. Something was crawling out of the shadows under the bed. Not physical, not visible to the eye, but Dan could feel it. Cold, thick, viscous, as if the temperature in the barn had dropped 10 degrees in a second. Shadows on the walls were moving. They were reaching toward Noelle, toward her hands, toward her face, toward the brand on her cheek. The system issued a warning. Shadow fragment. Unstable activation. Host control level. Crit low. Recommendation. Physical contact with the Keymaster. Dan didn't think. He stepped toward the bed. Lyra grabbed his arm. Her grip was ironclad. She told him not to touch her sister. Dan looked into her eyes. He said that if he didn't touch Noelle within the next 10 seconds, the shadows would tear her consciousness apart. He didn't know where those words came from. The system prompted him, or instinct, or the other. Lyra didn't let go. 5 seconds. The shadows on the walls began to whisper. Voices. Many voices. Children's. Women's. They were all saying the same word. Run. 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 Noelle arched her back. Lyra let go of his hand. Dan placed his palm on Noelle's forehead. Her skin was ice cold. Wet. The empty mark on his chest flashed white. The shadows recoiled, as if burned. The voices fell silent. Noelle went limp. Her breathing evened out. The shadows returned to their places. Ordinary shadows. From the table, from the chair, from the stove. The system logged it. Shadow fragment, stabilized, temporarily. Next unstable activation in 12 hours, plus or minus 3. 12 hours. This happens every night for 4 years in a row. Dan withdrew his hand. Noelle was asleep. Her face was wet with sweat. The brand on her cheek glowed red. Lyra stood nearby. The knife was lowered. She looked at Dan, not with trust, with something else, with a question. She asked what he had done. Dan said that the blank seal extinguishes unstable fragments upon direct contact. He had learned this himself 30 seconds ago. Lyra sank down onto the edge of the bed. She said that for 4 years they had tried everything. Herbs, prayers, rituals. Lyra herself would lie down next to Noelle every night and hold her hands while she screamed. Nothing helped. The screams didn't stop. The shadows didn't go away. And he simply placed his hand on her forehead. Dan didn't know what to say. He wasn't a healer. He was an empty key. but that empty key turned out to be the only thing that could lock the door that had stood wide open for 4 years inside the mind of a 17-year-old girl. Mireille was sitting in the corner. Her silver eyes were open. She was looking at Dan. She said she'd seen his seal flare up. She said that an empty seal isn't empty. There's something inside it. A structure, a web of lines visible only when activated, like invisible ink on parchment, like code that exists only when executed. Dan nodded. He was thinking the same thing. Morning, porridge made from the last handful of grain. 4 servings, 3 bowls, 1 mug. Noelle woke up calm. She didn't remember the scream. She didn't remember the shadows. She only remembered that she'd slept well. For the first time in a long time, she looked at Dan, then at the porridge. She picked up a bowl. She ate slowly, not like yesterday, not like a starving beast, like a human being. The system noted it. +2 to Noelle's trust rating. Current level, 11. The 10-point threshold has been crossed. She accepts food from his hands without checking for poison. She ate his porridge and didn't even think about poison. A small step, a huge one for a 17-year-old girl who for 4 years had trusted no one but her 2 sisters. Dan stepped out of the shed. He needed food. He was out of grain. He had no money. Barter was his only option. He walked through the village. He looked around. He memorized everything. Dan Hawk's body had walked these streets for 3 years, but he remembered every house, every fence, every pothole in the road. Dan used that memory. The blacksmith's house, the broken latch on the gate, the miller's house, a warped water wheel, the widow's house on the outskirts, a collapsed roof over the hayloft. The village was falling apart. Gregor collected taxes and didn't spend a single coin on repairs. People patched things up as best they could, poorly, clumsily. Dan saw the solutions. The blacksmith's bolt didn't need to be repaired, it needed to be repositioned. The hinges were on the wrong side. The miller's wheel was warped because the support stone had sunk. Lift the stone, wedge it in place. 20 minutes work. The widow's roof needed 2 new beams. Not the whole roof, just 2 beams. He could see it. Daniel saw the systems, the interconnections, the causes and effects. A broken latch isn't the blacksmith's problem. It's a gateway to barter. He started with the miller. Horst, the miller. Sullen, a man of few words, not angry, just tired. The mill wheel had been creaking and running at half speed for a year. Dan walked up and said he could fix the wheel in half an hour. The price? A sack of flour. Horst looked at him as if he were crazy. Then he shrugged. A sack of flour for half an hour's work was a bargain. If a farmhand broke the wheel for good, you could just beat him up. Dan crawled under the wheel. He found a stone that had settled out of place, a lever made from a log, a wedge made from a piece of broken board. 15 minutes. The wheel was level again. It was running at full speed. Horst opened his mouth and closed it. He didn't say thank you. He carried out a sack of flour and set it at Dan's feet. Then he carried out another one, and he grumbled that Dan should take both and get out of there before Horst changed his mind. 2 sacks of flour, enough food for a week if he was careful. Dan was dragging the sacks toward the barn when a woman appeared on the road. Red hair, a dirty traveling cloak, a shoulder bag stuffed with herbs, a flask at her belt, green eyes, bright, too bright for a traveler who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days. She stopped in the middle of the road and looked at Dan, then at the barn behind him, then back at Dan. She said that she was looking for a house with 3 seals. Dan set the sacks down on the ground. He asked who she was. She said her name was Celeste Rain and that she was a wandering herbalist. She said she'd heard about the 3 cursed sisters in a village 2 days' journey from here and had come to take a look. She said it was easy. As if 2 days on foot through the forest were just a stroll. Dan didn't believe her. No one walks for 2 days just to look at 3 cursed girls. People run away from the cursed. They don't go to them. He told her to wait. He went into the barn. Lyra was sitting at the table, sharpening a knife. A habit. Dan said there was a woman on the road who knew about them and wanted to come in. Lyra stood up, knife in hand. She stepped out onto the threshold. She looked at Celeste. Celeste looked at Lyra. 2 women, both ready for a fight.
both tired, both used to not trusting anyone. Celeste raised her hands. She showed her palms. Empty. She said she was unarmed. She said she had medicine and food and information. Lyra didn't move. She asked what kind of information. Celeste said she knew who Queen Asheri was. She said she knew why the 3 seals of the sisters were considered a curse. She said she knew the true story, not the one the church tells.
Lyra gripped her knife tighter. Myre appeared behind her, silently, like a shadow, her silver eyes fixed on Celeste. Myre remained silent. Then she spoke a single sentence. She said that Celeste's line of death would end in 8 months, and that it would end here, in this village, right here with them. Celeste didn't flinch. She said she knew. She said that was exactly why she'd come. Because if she was destined to die, it was better to die doing something important than to wander the roads treating peasants' blisters. Lyra looked at Dan. For the first time, she looked at him as a person whose opinion mattered. Not as her husband, not as a farmhand, as a member of her pack who had a voice. Dan said, "Let her in." Celeste entered the barn. Noelle was sitting on the bed. She saw Celeste and pressed herself against the wall. A new person. Danger. Always danger. Celeste sat down on the floor by the door. Not at the table, not on the bed, on the floor. Like Dan, she took a bundle out of her bag, unwrapped it. Dried meat, cheese, bread, herbs, ointment in a clay jar. She said the ointment was for the burn on the younger girl's cheek. Noelle touched the brand, a reflex. It had hurt every day, for 4 years. Celeste held out the ointment, not to Noelle, but to Lyra, because she realized who made the decisions in this family. Lyra took the jar, opened it, sniffed it. She looked at Myre. Myre nodded. Not poison. Lyra applied the ointment to Noelle's brand. The youngest hissed in pain. Then she froze. Then she relaxed. For the first time in 4 years, the brand didn't burn. The system recorded the data. +3 to Noelle's trust level, 14. +2 to Lyra's, 12. +1 to Myre's, 18. A new member. Celesta Rain, trust level 15, base level. Celesta ate bread and told her story. She spoke of Queen Asheri. 1,000 years ago, Asheri ruled Veldgard, not alone, with 3 others, the 3 wives of the founding king. 4 keys to power, 1 system. Power divided among 4, not because one was weak, because one is always vulnerable. Asheri created the seals, not the church. The seals were created as a system of trust. Every person received a seal at birth. The seal did not determine fate. The seal determined connections, with whom you could start a family, with whom you could build power, with whom you could share a key. The church came later. When Asheri fell, the church rewrote the system. It transformed the seals from a tool of connection into an instrument of control. The seal now defined not connections, but restrictions, not what you could do, but what you were forbidden to do. 3 fragments of the Asheri system were shattered and scattered across bloodlines. The church hunted them for 1,000 years. It burned the bearers. It called them the cursed ones. The 3 Vesper sisters were the last. Lyra listened in silence. Myre listened with her eyes closed. Noelle listened with her knees pressed to her chest. When Celesta finished, it was quiet in the barn. Only the fire crackled in the stove. Lyra asked how Celeste knew all this. Celeste replied that she had been a nun in the Order of the 3 Faces for 10 years. She had seen the archives. She had read the forbidden texts. She knew what the church was hiding. And then she fled. Because she couldn't be part of an organization that burned people for being born with the wrong mark. Lyra asked why they should believe her. Celeste said they didn't have to. She said trust couldn't be demanded. It could only be earned. She said she was ready to stay and prove it. With time, with actions, with her life if necessary. Dan listened.
he thought. Celeste knew too much. She'd arrived at just the right time. She was saying all the right things. Or was she who she claimed to be? Or was she a trap? He looked at Murray. Murray understood the look. She said that Celeste's line of death would end in 8 months, and that the last thing Murray saw in that line was Celeste shielding Noelle with her own body. Celeste would die saving her younger sister. In 8 months. The barn fell silent. Celeste didn't know this. Now she looked at Noelle. Noelle looked at her. 2 pairs of eyes. One pair wild and frightened, the other green and calm. Calm because Celeste had already accepted what Murray had seen. Lyra said one word. Stay. Celeste nodded. Footsteps sounded from behind the barn wall. Heavy, many of them. Lyra jumped to her feet, knife in hand. Dan stood up. The barn door swung open. A soldier in chain mail stood in the doorway. Behind him were 2 more. Behind them was Gregor. A red face, small eyes, a malicious smile. The village headman said he'd brought a guest. Dan looked past the soldiers' backs. A horseman stood on the road, a black horse, a black cloak, a symbol on his chest. 3 faces in a single circle. The Order, Lord of the 3 Faces, the Inquisitor. Not Thorn, another one, a junior one, an assistant, a scout. Gregor had brought him ahead of schedule, 25 days early. The system updated the data. Attention, a representative of the Order is in the village. Threat level, critical. Timer adjustment. Festival of Purification. No changes, 30 days. But the Junior Inquisitor is here now, and he's looking at the barn, and he sees 5 people inside. And on Gregor's face is the smile of a man who thinks he's won. The Junior Inquisitor's name was Cassian Worth, 23 years old, a gaunt face, narrow eyes, slender fingers on the hilt of his sword. He didn't look dangerous. He looked like a bureaucrat, meticulous, precise, pedantic. It was precisely people like that who were the most dangerous. A fanatic strikes without thinking. A pedant follows instructions to the letter, and the Order of the 3 Faces instructions regarding the damned left no room for maneuver. Cassian dismounted. He took off his gloves, folded them neatly. He looked at the barn, at Dan, at sisters behind him, at Celeste. He said he had arrived at the request of Elder Gregor Molt to conduct a preliminary inspection of 3 bearers of non-standard seals and 1 bearer of an empty seal, registered as a family unit in the church registry. He spoke evenly, without emotion, every word like a sharpened nail. Gregor stood behind him, sweating. His smile was no longer so confident. He had summoned the Inquisitor to hasten the execution. But an Inquisitor is no village thug. An Inquisitor is a procedure. And a procedure requires time and documents. Cassian asked to see the marriage certificate. Dan produced the document, signed by Bervin, with a date, with names, with the clerk's seal. Cassian read it for a long time, carefully, every line. Then he asked to see the entry in the church register. Gregor produced the register. His hands were shaking, just a little. Dan noticed. Cassian noticed too. The Inquisitor compared the dates. The certificate was signed 2 days ago. The entry in the register was dated a week earlier. A discrepancy. Cassian looked at Gregor. He asked why the registration date preceded the date of their first meal together. Gregor opened his mouth,
then closed it. He opened it again. He began to explain that it was a mistake, a slip of the pen. He'd meant a different date. He'd gotten confused. Cassian didn't interrupt. He listened, and he wrote down every word Gregor said in a small notebook, in precise, fine handwriting. Dan stood there in silence. He didn't interfere. The luck system was working. Plus P 15% toward a favorable outcome. Not magic, just things working out a little better than they should have. Gregor got tangled up in his own lies a little faster. Cassian noticed the tremor in his hands a little sooner. The wind blew a page from the register away just at the wrong moment, and Gregor reached for it and dropped 3 more pages, and Cassian saw the other entries, with other discrepancies. Luck. Not a miracle. Just a shift in probability. Cassian closed the book. He said that the marriage certificate had been drawn up correctly and was legally valid.
He said that the discrepancy in the dates in the registry would be investigated separately.
He said that the Hawk family unit was protected by law until the Feast of Purification, when Senior Inquisitor Valerius Thorn would arrive for a full investigation. Until then, no one had the right to harm members of the Hawk family without the Order's authorization. Gregor turned pale. His plan had fallen apart. He had wanted to hasten the execution. Instead, the Inquisitor had granted Dan protection, legal protection, temporary, but protection nonetheless. 27 days, officially. Cassian turned to Dan. He said he would return in 3 days to inspect the seals. He said all 4 must be present. He said any attempt to escape would be considered an admission of heresy. Dan nodded. Cassian mounted his horse and rode away. Gregor remained. He stood on the road. He looked at the barn. His eyes were small, evil, but now there was fear in them. Not fear of Dan, fear of Cassian's book, of the records, of other discrepancies in the registry that the Inquisitor might find. Gregor left without saying a word. Dan entered the barn. Lyra was standing by the wall, a knife in her hand, her knuckles white. She was listening everything through the wall. She said Dan had taken a risk. If the report had been drafted incorrectly, the Inquisitor would have burned them on the spot. Dan said the report had been drafted correctly because he'd spent an hour last night recalling every document that Dan Hawk's body had carried to the village headman over the past 3 years. The format, the wording, the seals, everything by the book. Lyra looked at him. She said that farmhands don't know the procedures. Dan said that this farmhand does. She didn't ask any further questions, but she stopped sharpening the knife. She set it on the table, open, and sat down. The system noted it. +2 to Lyra's trust rating. 14. Murray was sitting in the corner. She said that Inquisitor Cassian's line of death was long, very long. He wouldn't die here. He would leave and return. And when he returns, someone else will be with him. Someone with a short, bright line. Thorn. Dan nodded. 27 days. 3 days until Cassian's return to inspect the seals. Inspection of the seals. A problem. The sisters' seals were non-standard. The church classified them as curses. The inspection would reveal that. Cassian would record it in the book. Thorn would receive the report. Evidence for the stake, Dan thought. He thought like a programmer who sees a bug in the system and looks for the cause, not a patch. The marks were non-standard. But what does a standard mark mean? Who defines the standard? The church. The church uses the registry. The registry is a database. Each mark is described by a set of parameters: pattern, brightness, location on the body, and resonance with other marks in the lineage. If the parameters match an entry in the registry, the mark is pure. If they don't match, it's a curse. But Celesta said that the church rewrote the system 1,000 years ago. That means the registry is incomplete or distorted. That means the parameters the church considers deviations are actually part of the original design. Like legacy code that works but whose documentation has been lost, and new developers consider it a bug even though it's a feature. Dan smiled. For the first time in 3 days in this body, he knew how to fool the inspection. Not to forge the seals, that's impossible, but to present them so they looked standard. A composite seal. Luck plus a master key. When synchronized, the fragments resonate with his blank seal. Resonance looks like harmony. Harmony in the church registry is a sign of a pure lineage, a family of 4 harmonious seals. Not cursed. Lineage. He needed 3 days. 3 days to build enough trust to synchronize the second fragment. Myrae. Foresight. Her trust is already at 18, up to 22 points. The threshold is 20. She voluntarily shares a fragment of her story. 2 points. 2 days. He started small. That evening he sat by the stove. The sisters were on the bed. Celeste was on the floor by the wall. She was asleep, snoring softly, a flask in her hand. Dan asked Myrae about her eyes, not about the mark, not about her foresight, about her eyes. He asked if it hurt her. Myrae fell silent. Then she answered. She said that the silver film wasn't blindness, it was a filter. The world was too bright for her. Not because of the light, because of the lines. Every person carries a line of death. A thin thread that stretches upward from the crown of the head and snaps at the moment of future death. Myrae sees them all, always, every second. The film over her eyes dims the lines. Without the film, she sees the world as a tangle of threads.
Every person is an endpoint.
Every person is a future corpse. She sees the world as a cemetery that doesn't yet know it's a cemetery. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't pity her. He didn't comfort her. He just listened. Myra continued. She said she had seen her mother's death 3 weeks in advance. Her mother was doing laundry by the river. The line above her head was short. 3 weeks. Myra told her father. Her father didn't believe her. Myra told her sisters. Lyra believed her. But what could they do? Her mother drowned in the river 20 days later, exactly when the line broke off. Since then, Myra hadn't told anyone about what she saw. She kept silent. She wore the film. She pretended to be blind, because a truth that no one believes is worse than silence. Dan said he believed her. Myra turned her head toward him. Her silver eyes sparkled. She asked why. Dan said that in his previous job, he'd worked with systems that predicted events based on data. He said that prediction isn't magic, it's reading patterns. She sees a pattern that others don't see. It's not a curse, it's an ability. And an ability doesn't become evil just because the world isn't ready for it.
Myra was silent for a long time. Then she said that he was the first person in her entire life who had called her vision an ability rather than a curse. The system noted, set +3 to Myra's trust. 21. The 20-point threshold has been crossed. She's voluntarily sharing a fragment of her story. She had just shared something, and it wasn't just a story, it was a clue. The second clue. Myra said something else. She said that at night she films. At night, the world is dark enough that the lines don't blind her. At night she sees clearly. And last night she watched the sleeping people in the village. She saw their lines. Short ones, long ones, jagged ones, straight ones. But one person had no line at all. Dan. And there was something else. One person in the village had a line not above their head, but beneath their feet. It went down, into the ground, like a root. Not a line of death. Something else. Someone in the village bore a mark that shouldn't be there. A mark that grows not upward toward death, but downward toward something else. Dan asked who. Myra shook her head. She couldn't make it out. It was too far away. But she could try tomorrow night. If Dan was with her.
Because when she's near him, the lines behave differently. Calmer. Quieter. His empty seal dampens the interference. Next to him, she sees more clearly. Dan said he'd be there. The system noted it. The condition for synchronizing the fragment of foresight has been met. Ready. 80%. Joint activation required within 48 hours. 2 days. Cassian would be back in 3. Dan went to sleep on the floor, with his back to the sisters, facing the door. The 4th day. Dan woke up before dawn. His body ached. The floor was hard and cold, and 3 nights on it had turned his back into one big knot. But the pain was familiar. Dan Hawk's body knew no other. He got up quietly. Checked the door. Locked. Checked the window. Intact. Checked on the sisters. Asleep. Celeste was by the wall. She was asleep too. The flask was empty. He went outside. The morning air was damp and heavy. Fog lay over the village like a wet blanket. The roofs of the houses jutted out of the fog like little islands. It was quiet. Even the roosters were silent. Dan walked to the stream. He washed his face. The water was freezing. His body shuddered. He forced himself to stand there.
The cold cleared his head. He needed a clear head. Today and tomorrow. 2 days until the inspection of the seals. The plan was simple in theory, but difficult to execute. Synchronize the fragment of foresight with the keymaster. This required joint activation. For joint activation, Myra would have to voluntarily use her ability at his request. The threshold was 50. Her trust level was 21. Far from 50. But the system offered an alternative path. Joint activation does not require the full threshold. It requires voluntary consent for a one-time use, a single instance, not permanent, like a temporary access token. Myra had already agreed to go with him at night and look at the lines. That was consent. Voluntary. For a one-time use. The system accepted this as a sufficient condition. 80% readiness. 20% remained. Dan didn't know what that 20% was. The system didn't explain. He returned to the shed. He cooked porridge with Horst's flour, thicker than yesterday. 4 servings. 5. Celeste ate 2. She took some salt out of her bag. A pinch.
a tiny one, but porridge with salt was a whole different world compared to porridge without salt.
Noelle ate 2 servings. No one said anything. Lyra ate in silence. She stared at the wall. She was thinking. Dan could see the muscles in her cheekbones twitching. She was thinking about Cassian, about the examination, about what would happen in 2 days. She said that when the Inquisitor saw their marks, he would understand. Luck, foresight, shadow. 3 fragments that the Church considers shards of heresy. Cassian would write it all down in his notebook. Thorn would receive the report, and he'd arrive not in 27 days, but sooner, just as Cassian had arrived sooner. Dan said there was a plan. Lyra looked at him. She didn't ask what it was. She waited. Dan explained. The composite seal. When the fragments are synchronized with the keymaster, they resonate. Resonance looks like harmony. 4 harmonious seals in one family aren't a curse. It's a lineage. Cassian won't see 3 curses and an empty seal. He'll see 4 elements of a single system, like 4 notes of a single chord, strange on their own. Together, harmony. Lyra asked what was needed for that. Dan said they needed to synchronize all 3 fragments. Right now, 1 is synchronized. Luck. Hers. 2 more are needed. Mireille and Noelle. Lyra looked at her sisters. Mireille nodded. She had already agreed. Noelle hadn't. Noelle was sitting on the bed, staring at her bare feet. Her shadow lay on the floor, motionless, but too dark for the morning light, too dense. Lyra called her name. Noelle didn't answer. Lyra called again. Noelle lifted her head. Her eyes were empty. She said the shadows didn't want her to. The shadows said not to. The shadows said that if she revealed her fragment, they would leave, and if they left, she would be alone. Dan understood. For 4 years, the shadows in Noelle's head had been the only constant voices in her life. Her sisters were nearby, but her sisters were silent during the day and kept their distance. The shadows, however, spoke constantly, day and night, without pause. The voices of her deceased maternal aunts, infants who had died at birth. They lived in Noelle's shadows and whispered to her, "Run, hide, don't trust anyone." They were her worst enemies and her only friends at the same time. Asking Noelle to synchronize a fragment meant asking her to betray the only ones who hadn't left her for 4 years. Dan didn't press the issue. He said they had 2 days. He said he'd start with Mireille. Noelle could decide for herself, whenever she wanted, if she wanted to. He left. Noelle stayed on the bed. The shadow beneath her stirred. The day was spent working. Dan fixed the blacksmith's bolt. The blacksmith, Rondar, huge, silent, hands like shovels. He didn't thank Dan. He gave him 2 iron hooks and a coil of wire. Tools, priceless in a village where everything broke and no one knew how to fix anything. Dan repaired the widow's roof. The widow Myron, old, hunchbacked, teary eyes. She gave him a pot of boiled turnips and an old blanket. The blanket smelled musty, but it was warm. Dan carried it to the shed and gave it to Noelle. He didn't say a word. He just laid it down next to her. Noelle looked at the blanket, then at Dan. Then she wrapped herself in it and turned her back to the wall. The system noted it. +1 for Noelle's trust. 15. Small steps. Each step was another brick in the wall that separated Noelle from the world and that was slowly being dismantled. Not broken down, dismantled. 1 brick at a time. In the evening, Celeste monitored the sisters professionally. She knew what she was doing. Her hands were quick, precise. She checked Lyra's pulse. She looked at Mireille's pupils. She examined Noelle's brand. The ointment was working. The inflammation had subsided. The brand was still an ugly scar, but it no longer burned. Celeste said that Lyra was suffering from chronic stress. Her back and neck muscles were so tense that her vertebrae could barely move. For 3 years, she had carried her 2 sisters on her back. Physically, it looked like a back that had forgotten how to relax. Celeste offered a massage. Lyra refused, sharply. She wouldn't let anyone touch her. Anyone. Celeste didn't insist.
She said the ointment was on the table and Lyra could apply it herself. Lara didn't answer, but that night Dan heard her quietly fiddling around in bed. The ointment. She'd applied the ointment herself when she thought everyone was asleep. Night. A full moon. Light streamed through the cracks in the walls. Gray. Cold. Dan touched Myra on the shoulder, gently. She wasn't asleep. She was waiting. They stepped out of the shed. Myra removed the bandage from her eyes. For the first time, Dan saw her eyes. Not silver. Golden. Bright. Like two lanterns in the dark. She could see. Perfectly.
Better than he could in complete darkness. She looked out at the village and saw what no one else could see. Lines. Thin, glowing threads stretching upward from every sleeping house. From every sleeping person. Long threads of life. Short threads of imminent death. Bright threads for the healthy. Dull threads for the sick. Myra pointed. Gregor's house. The village elder's line was jagged and winding, not short, but tangled, like that of a man whose fate depends on decisions he hasn't yet made. The blacksmith's house. Rondar's line was straight and long. He would live a long life. The baker's house. Olaf's line was of medium length, calm. The widow Myron's house, the line was short, dull. This winter. Myra said it matter-of-factly, without emotion. She was used to seeing death. Dan wasn't. He clenched his fists. The widow who had given him a blanket would die this winter, and there was nothing he could do. Or maybe there was. He didn't know. Not yet. Myra pointed again to the edge of the village, the last house by the forest, abandoned, or so it seemed. The windows were dark, the door was boarded up, but a line stretched out from there, not upward, downward, into the ground. Thick, dark. Myra said it was the line she'd seen last night, not the line of death, the line of something else. Something, or someone in that house, bore a mark that worked differently from all the others. Dan stared at the abandoned house. The system didn't react. No notifications, no data. Whatever was in that house, the system didn't see it, or didn't want to show it. Myra turned to him. Her golden eyes glowed in the moonlight. She said she wanted to try. Dan asked what exactly. She said she wanted to look at his seal, with her own eyes, without the film. She wanted to see what was hidden within the empty circle. Dan unbuttoned his shirt. A white circle on his chest. Dull. Myra came close. She placed her fingers on his chest, next to the mark, not on it, next to it. Her fingers were cold. She looked. Her golden eyes didn't blink. She said she could see it. The empty circle wasn't empty. Inside it was a web, delicate, complex, like a diagram, like a map. Hundreds of lines that don't glow on their own. They're waiting. They're waiting for a signal. And one of them is already glowing. A thin thread from his mark to something invisible. To Lyra. The first thread. Luck. Synchronized, and next to it, a second thread, dim, barely visible, ready to light up. Mireille, foresight,
Mireille looked him in the eyes. She asked if he was ready. Dan said he was ready. Mireille closed her eyes. She opened them. The golden light in her eyes grew brighter. She activated her seal, voluntarily, for the first time in her life, not because a threat forced her to, not because death was standing right beside her, because she decided to do it herself. Dan sensed it. The second thread on his chest flared up. Thin, silvery, it stretched from his seal to Mireille. The system registered it. The second-level composite seal has been activated. Luck plus foresight plus the Keymaster. The effect. In the face of a mortal threat, Mireille sees 3 to 7 seconds of the future. When actively synchronized with the Keymaster, the accuracy of her foresight increases by 30%. Side effect. Mireille loses 1 day of vision after each use. When synchronized, the loss is reduced to 2 hours. Dan sensed it. His empty seal was no longer dim. 2 threads inside. 2 out of 3. Mireille staggered. He supported her by the shoulder. She smiled. A small, quiet smile.
The first smile he'd ever seen on her face. She said she could feel him. Not physically. Deeper. As if his mark were an anchor in a storm. And next to that anchor, the lines of death don't scream. They whisper. And for the first time in 20 years, she could look at the world without pain. They returned to the shed. Mireille put the film back on. She lay down. She fell asleep almost immediately. For the first time in a long time, she fell asleep quickly and peacefully. The system noted it. +5 to Mireille's trust rating. 26. Dan lay down on the floor. 2 threads. 2 out of 3. 1 day until Cassian's examination. Noelle isn't synchronized yet. A fragment of the shadow. The most unstable. The most dangerous. The most essential. Without the 3rd thread, the cord is incomplete. Cassian will see 3 seals and an empty one. 2 are synchronized, 1 is not. An unfinished chord. Dissonance. A question. Dan closed his eyes. He didn't know how to get through to Noelle. He didn't know how to overcome the voices in her head. He didn't know how to convince a 17-year-old girl to betray the only friends she'd known for 4 years. He didn't know. But he had 1 day.
The wind rustled quietly beyond the wall. Something stirred in the shadows under Noelle's bed. Not a shadow, not a voice. Something new. Something that had heard every word Dan had said over the past 4 days. Something that was beginning to doubt that run was the only possible answer. The morning of the 5th day. The last day before the inspection. Dan was cooking porridge. Thick. With salt. Celeste added dried herbs from her bag. It turned out almost edible. Noelle ate in silence, wrapped in a blanket. She didn't look at Dan, but she didn't hide her face from him either. A small step. After breakfast, Dan went out and walked toward the abandoned house on the edge of the village. He thought about the line that Mireille had seen, a line leading down, into the ground. Not death. Something else. He had to check it out. The house stood by the forest, old, crooked. The boards over the windows had turned black from the rain. The door was boarded up crisscross, but the wood on the nails was fresher than the rest. Someone had boarded up the door recently, not years ago, weeks. Dan walked around the house, the back wall, a window. A board was coming loose. He peered inside. Darkness. Dust. No furniture. The floor was bare, but in the center of the floor was a circle, burned into the wood, black, perfectly round, geometrically perfect. Inside the circle were symbols. Dan didn't know this language, but the system did. Warning: Seal of Oblivion detected. Fragment 4 of 4. Status: inactive. Carrier: unknown. Recommendation: leave the area immediately. The fourth fragment. In an abandoned house on the edge of the village, the Seal of Oblivion, which Dan didn't know about yet, which the system had warned him about with a single word: leave. Dan stepped away from the window. His heart was pounding fast. For the first time in 5 days in this body, he felt real fear. Not fear of the village elder, not fear of the Inquisitor, fear of something greater than all of them. The fourth fragment, the fourth key. Inquisitor Valerius Thorn, keeper of the Seal of Oblivion. Thorn had already been here, not in person. His seal, his mark, driven into the floor of an abandoned house in the village where, in 26 days, he would light a bonfire. This was no coincidence. Thorn knew about this village long before the three sisters were sent here. He knew because he himself had prepared this place. He himself had drawn the circle. He himself had carved the symbols into the floor. Hawk Hollow wasn't just some random backwater for disposing of the cursed. Hawk Hollow was a trap, and Dan had just realized he'd walked right into it willingly. He went back to the barn. He didn't tell anyone about the house. Not yet. Too much information for one day. Too much fear for people who were just beginning to let go of their own. That evening, Dan sat by the stove. Everyone was silent. Tomorrow was the inspection. Tomorrow Cassian would come and examine their marks. The two were synchronized. One was not. Noelle sat on the bed, wrapped in a blanket. A shadow lay quietly beneath her. Dan didn't look at her. He was telling his story, not to her, but to everyone. Yet, in a way, to her as well. He was talking about the system he'd worked in during his past life. Multi-signature. 3 keys. No transaction goes through without the consent of all 3. Not because one key is weak, because one key is vulnerable. One key can be stolen. One key can be forged. One key can be broken. But 3 keys together are a wall. 3 keys together are trust encoded in code. 3 people who say, yes, I agree. Yes, I confirm. Yes, I'm with you. He wasn't talking about Noelle. He wasn't asking. He wasn't trying to persuade them. He was telling a story. His story. The story of a man who for 26 years didn't know how to trust and died alone at his keyboard because he never learned to share keys. Noelle listened. The shadow under the bed listened too. The voices in the shadow were silent. For the first time in 4 years, they weren't whispering, run. They were listening. Noelle stood up. The blanket slipped off her shoulders. She walked over to Dan. Her bare feet on the cold floor. She crouched down next to him. Not across from him. Next to him. Shoulder to shoulder. She didn't say anything, but her shadow on the floor reached toward his shadow. Slowly, carefully, like a hand reaching for another hand in the dark. The shadows touched. Dan felt the cold. Then warmth. Then voices. Quiet. Distant. Children's voices. They were saying, don't run. They were saying his name. Dan. They were saying, thank you. A third thread flashed across his chest. Thin. Dark. Like ink on white paper. 3 threads. 3 fragments. 1 blank seal. The system registered it. The 3rd level composite seal has been activated. All 3 frag are synchronized with the master key. The cord is complete. Full resonance. Effect. Upon inspection, all 4 seals read as a single, coordinated system. Classification. Kind. Not a curse. Kind. Noelle began to cry. Quietly. Soundlessly. Tears streamed down her cheeks past the brand. The shadow on the floor embraced Dan's shadow. And somewhere deep within that shadow, a voice older than all voices whispered. Finally. The system noted. +7 to Noelle's trust score. 22. +3 for Lyra. 17. +2 for Mireille. 28. Lyra stood by the table. She saw everything. The 3 threads on Dan's chest. Noelle's tears. The shadows embracing each other. She didn't say a word, but her hand on the table unclenched. She wasn't holding a knife. She wasn't holding anything. Her hand lay with her palm facing up. The morning of the 6th day, Cassian Worth arrived at dawn. Alone. No soldiers. A black horse. A black cloak. A book in his hand. He dismounted by the barn and knocked 3 times. Precisely. Meticulously. Dan opened the door.
Cassian entered. He surveyed the barn with a single glance. 4 people. A 5th by the wall. He asked who the 5th person was. Dan said he didn't, a stranger. A guest, not a family member. Cassian jotted it down in his book. Then he asked them to present their seals, one at a time, starting with the eldest.
Lyra stood up, her back straight, her face like a stone mask. She unbuttoned the top button of her shirt and bared her collarbone. Lyra's seal was located on the left side of her chest, below her collarbone, a white pattern on her skin, 3 intertwined circles. The church called this pattern the mark of the bringer of misfortune. Cassian stepped closer. He took a glass lens on a chain out of his pocket. He held it up to his eye. He looked for a long time. Dan stood nearby and felt the empty seal on his chest pulsing quietly. 3 threads inside it hummed. Resonance. It was working. Lyra's seal did not glow on its own, but it responded to Dan's pulse. A subtle vibration, visible only through the Inquisitor's lens. Cassian frowned. He jotted something down in his notebook. Then he turned to Myre. Myre was sitting on the bed.
She brushed her hair back from the nape of her neck. Her mark was on the back of her neck, a silvery pattern, an eye at the center of a web, the mark of the gaze of death. Cassian held the lens to her neck. He looked. The same vibration, the same resonance. Myre's mark hummed in time with Dan's, 2 elements of the same system. Cassian made a note. Noelle. The younger one got out of bed. A blanket draped over her shoulders. She didn't want to show her mark. Her mark was on her back, between her shoulder blades, a dark pattern, 3 shadows woven into a knot. The mark of the shadow speaker. The most dangerous of the 3 according to the church's classification. Noelle turned her back to Cassian. Lyra lifted her shirt, carefully, like a mother undressing her child in front of a doctor. Cassian placed the lens against her skin. The 3rd resonance. 3 seals, 3 elements, 1 rhythm. Cassian slowly removed the lens. He turned to Dan. He asked him to show the empty seal. Dan unbuttoned his shirt. A white circle on his chest, but not empty. Not anymore. Inside the circle were 3 thin threads, white, silver, dark, barely visible to the naked eye.
But through the Inquisitor's lens, they glowed. Cassian stared for a long time. His expression did not change, but Dan noticed his hand holding the lens tremble. Cassian had seen something he hadn't expected to see. 4 seals in resonance, 4 elements of a single system. Coherence, harmony, not a curse. Kin. Cassian set the lens aside. He closed the book. He said that the results of the examination would be sent to Senior Inquisitor Valerius Thorn for final classification. He said that until the Feast of Purification, the Hawk family would remain under observation. He said he recommended waiting status. Not a curse, not pure. Waiting. He walked out, mounted his horse, rode away. Gregor stood by his house and watched. He saw that Cassian had not arrested anyone. He didn't pass a sentence. He didn't light a bonfire. The village elder's face flushed red, then it turned pale. Then he went into the house and slammed the door so hard the walls shook. Dan closed the barn door. He exhaled. Lyra stood by the wall. She was looking at him. She said he had planned it. Every step, every chronology. The bread in the square, the night with Myre, and the story for Noelle.
It was all part of the plan. Dan said yes. She asked what else he had planned. Dan said nothing yet. He was improvising. Lyra looked at him. For the first time, something resembling respect flashed across her face. Not warm, cold, like a general's respect for a worthy opponent.
She said that if he betrayed them after all this, she wouldn't just kill him in his sleep. She'd make sure he never woke up, neither in this life nor the next. Dan said that was fair. The system noted it. +2 to Lyra's trust rating. 19. A paradox. She'd threatened him, and his trust in her grew. Because the threat was honest. Because honesty is the first step, even if that honesty sounds like a promise to kill. The day went on. Dan worked. He fixed a neighbor's gate. He got 2 eggs. He fixed the hinge on Widow Mirren's shutter. He got an old raincoat. He fixed Miller Horst's leaky barrel. He got a piece of lard. The village was slowly getting used to him. It didn't accept him. It was getting used to him. The way one gets used to a stray dog that doesn't bite. Dan carried food to the barn. The porridge grew thicker. With lard. With eggs. Noel ate greedily. Mireille ate neatly. Lyra ate in silence.
Celeste cooked. She turned out to be a good cook. The healer's hands knew herbs and spices. She transformed meager supplies into something edible. The shed was slowly becoming a home. Not a beautiful one, not a cozy one, but a home. A place to return to. A place where they were expected. That evening, Noelle woke up screaming. The shadows again. But not like before. Not a nightmare. Something else. Noelle sat up in bed. Her eyes were wide open. The brand on her cheek burned. She said she'd seen him. Dan asked who. Noelle said she'd seen Thorn. The shadow had shown her. Inquisitor Valerius Thorn sat in a dark room. A map lay before him. A spot on the map was circled. Hawk Hollow. And next to the circle was an inscription. Noelle couldn't read, but the shadow read it for her. The inscription was in an ancient language, and it meant, "The anchor is ready, awakening in 30 days." Thorn wasn't going to Hawk Hollow to burn 4 heretics. He went to activate the 4th seal, the seal of oblivion, the one branded into the floor of the abandoned house. Dan felt a chill. An abandoned house, a circle on the floor, the 4th fragment. It's all connected. Thorn had prepared this house. Thorn had sent the sisters to this village. Thorn knew the bearer of the empty seal was here. The whole business with the bonfire and the execution was a smokescreen. Thorn's real goal was something else. He needed the 3 fragments in one place, next to the 4th. He needed resonance. He needed an awakening. An awakening of what? Noelle didn't know. The shadow hadn't revealed it. But the voice in the shadow said one word. Queen. Lyra turned pale. Mireille removed the bandage from her eyes. Golden eyes in the darkness of the barn. She looked at Noelle, at the shadow under the bed. She said that Noelle's shadow had changed. Before, it had contained only the voices of her dead maternal sisters. Now there was something else there. Something older. Something enormous. Something sleeping. Like the ocean beneath a layer of ice. Dan recalled lines from Celeste's document. Queen Achery, weaver of the 3 threads. She fell 1,000 years ago. The church says she is dead. But Celeste said that the 3 fragments are shards of her. Luck, foresight, shadow. The 3 abilities of a single woman, shattered and scattered across bloodlines. And the 4th fragment, oblivion. That is what the church used to seal her away. Thorn didn't want her to awaken. Thorn wanted to renew the seal. He wanted to gather the 3 fragments in one place, next to the 4th, and use the resonance to erase the remnants of Achery forever. Not burn them, erase them. Oblivion. That's why the sisters were sent here specifically. That's why the 4th seal is in the floor of an abandoned house. That's why 30 days. It's not a countdown to execution. It's the time it takes for the resonance to mature. The 3 fragments must synchronize with one another so that the 4th can absorb them all in a single blow. And Dan had just done that for Thorn. He had synchronized all 3 fragments. He had created the perfect target. Saray was silent. Lyra clenched her fists. Mireille closed her eyes. Noelle was trembling. Celeste sat against the wall, and for the first time in 3 days, wasn't drinking from her flask. Dan stood by the stove and thought. He thought like a programmer who had just learned that the feature he'd been building for a week was a backdoor for an attack. Synchronization was necessary. Without it, Cassian's inspection would have failed. Without it, they would have been burned today. But the synchronization had made them vulnerable to the 4th fragment. A trap within a trap. A Matryoshka doll. Dan closed his eyes. 25 days.
He had to find a way to defend against the fourth fragment. There was a way. He could feel it. The system was silent, but his intuition told him the answer was somewhere nearby. In the abandoned house, in the fourth seal, in the voice that Noel's shadow had called the queen. He opened his eyes. He looked at Lyra. She said one word. What should we're doing? Not a question. A statement. What we're doing. She waited for his order. Not because she was obedient, because she recognized that he had a plan, or would have a plan, or would come up with one. Because in 6 days, he hadn't let her down once. Dan said that tomorrow night he was going to the abandoned house. The 7th day. Night. The 5 of them walked through the village, quietly, without torches. The moon was hidden behind the clouds. The air was heavy and smelled of wet earth. Dan led the way. Lyra followed him, a knife on her belt. Mireille without her film. Her golden eyes glowed in the darkness.
She could see every line of every shadow of every sleeping person. Noelle was barefoot. The shadow beneath her feet trailed behind her like a second body. Celeste brought up the rear, a bag slung over her shoulder. Bundles of herbs stuck out of her coat pocket. The abandoned house stood on the edge of the village near the forest, a black silhouette against the backdrop of gray trees. Mireille stopped 20 paces away. She said the line went down, right beneath the house. Deep, deeper than the basement, deeper than the roots of the trees. She said it wasn't a seal on the floor. The seal on the floor was just the tip. Beneath it, something extended into the ground for tens of meters, like a root, like an anchor driven into the foundation of the world. Noelle crouched down. She placed her hands on the ground. She closed her eyes. The shadow beneath her blurred. It spread across the ground like ink. It reached toward the house. Noelle said she could hear them. Voices below. Not dead, not alive. In between. Stuck. She said there were many of them. Dozens. Hundreds. All the same. All saying the same thing. I don't remember. I don't remember. I don't remember. The seal of oblivion.
It didn't kill. It erased. Memory, identity, everything that made a person human. Thorn didn't burn heretics. He erased them and stored what remained underground. Underground. Under the houses. Under the villages. All across the borderlands. Dan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The gray moor. A disease that extinguishes the seals and turns people into the empty ones. It's not a disease. It's a side effect. The seal of oblivion works constantly. It emits energy, slowly, imperceptibly, like radiation. People near the anchor lose their seals. Not everyone, only the weakest. Those with tenuous bonds. Those with solitary seals lacking familial resonance. Loners, the poor, laborers, the empty ones. That's why Dan Hawk was born with an empty seal. He was born in this village, near the anchor. The seal of oblivion erased his seal at birth, left a white circle, a void. The body that the church deemed defective was a victim of the church's own weapon. Dan entered the house. The board covering the window came off easily. He squeezed his way inside. It was darker inside than out. The floor creaked. Dust swirled with every step. A circle on the floor glowed. Dimly. Blue. A deathly light. The symbols inside the circle moved. Slowly. Like the hands of a clock. The system activated. Attention. Seal of oblivion.
Active emission mode. Power, 3%. Estimated power at full activation, 100%. Radius of effect at full power, 5 kilometers. The entire village, all residents, all seals within the radius, erased, forever. Thorn wasn't just going to execute the 4 of them. He was going to wipe out the entire village. That's why he was coming. That's why there's the festival of purification. Purification isn't a bonfire. Purification is the full activation of the seal of oblivion. One strike, 5 kilometers of emptiness. No witnesses, no traces. The church will blame it all on the Gray Sea. Yet another village fell to the plague. How tragic, how sad. Burn the empty ones and forget. Dan stood above the circle and felt the cold rising from the floor through his legs, up his spine, and into his head. 3% power, and it was already cold. 100% would kill every living thing within the radius. Lyra climbed through the window after him. She stood beside him. She was looking at the circle.
Her white hair looked silver in the blue light. She said she recognized this symbol. She'd seen it before, in the mountains, where her family had been hiding for 300 years. There were circles just like this in the caves, old ones, extinguished, but the same. Her grandmother used to say they were graves, not of people, of memories, places where the church buried what should not exist. For the first time, Lyra told him about her family, of her own accord. Threshold 20, activated. She continued. She said that her Vesper clan had been in hiding for 300 years because they knew the truth. The seals are not a gift from the gods. The seals are the legacy of Ashiri. The Church of the Three Faces rewrote history. The 3 faces on their symbol are not 3 gods. They are the 3 wives of the founding king, Ashiri, Valora, and Nimue. 3 women who created the system of seals as a tool for connection between people, not control, but control. When the church overthrew them, it shattered the system into pieces, scattering 3 fragments and keeping the 4th for itself as a weapon. For 1,000 years, the church used oblivion to erase everyone who remembered.
The Vesper clan remembered. For that, they were burned. For that, they were driven out. For that, Lyra was branded at 15 and called a witch. For her memory. Lyra fell silent. Dan stood beside her. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't feel sorry for her. He listened. And when she finished, he said one thing. He said that in his world, too, there were people who rewrote the code so that no one would remember how the system originally worked. He said that such people were called legacy developers, and that the only way to defeat the legacy was to restore the documentation. Lyra looked at him. She didn't understand half the words, but she got the gist. He said they would restore the truth. She almost smiled. Almost. The corner of her mouth twitched, then froze. Not now. Myrae stepped into the house. She walked over to the circle. She crouched down. Her golden eyes looked downward. She said she could see lines, not of death, other kinds. Lines of memory. Hundreds of threads stretching into the ground. Each thread is someone's erased life. And among them, one thread is brighter than the rest. One thread that hasn't been completely erased, that resists, that remembers. Myrae reached out toward the circle. Dan grabbed her hand. Don't. 3% power. Direct contact could erase her seal. Myrae withdrew her hand. But she said that the thread that resists doesn't stretch downward, it stretches outward. Through the wall of the house, through the ground, toward the barn, toward Noelle. The Queen's voice in Noelle's shadow. It isn't a separate entity. It is that very thread. The last fragment of Ashiri's memory that the seal of oblivion couldn't erase.
because it was hidden in the only place oblivion couldn't reach, in the shadows, in the space between light and darkness, where the church never thought to look. Noelle waited outside. She didn't go inside the house. She couldn't. The shadows around the house screamed so loudly that she couldn't stand closer than 10 steps. Hundreds of voices. I don't remember. I don't remember. I don't remember. She sat on the ground, covering her ears, crying. Celeste sat beside her, hugging her, stroking her head. For the first time, Noelle didn't pull away from a stranger's touch, because the voices were louder than her fear. They returned to the barn, all 5 of them, in silence. Noelle fell asleep right away.
Exhausted. Lyra didn't sleep. Mireille didn't sleep. Celeste didn't sleep. Dan didn't sleep. 4 people awake in the darkness. Dan spoke softly. He laid out a plan. The 4th seal cannot be destroyed. It's too deep. It's too firmly rooted in the ground. But it can be redirected. If the 3 fragments are synchronized with the master key, the resonance will pass through it. He is the center. He is the node. If at the moment the seal of oblivion is activated, Dan is standing in the center of the circle, the blow will pass through him, through the empty seal, through the root key. And if the root key redirects the flow not outward but inward toward the system, then oblivion will not erase the seals. It will erase itself. Self-destruction. Like a recursive function with no exit condition, an infinite cycle of oblivion that forgets oblivion itself. The system confirmed it. Theoretical probability of success, 41%. Probability of the master key's destruction in the event of failure, 87%. Lyra said no. Her voice was steady, steely. She said that 1877% isn't a plan, it's suicide. Mireille said that if Dan dies, the system will reset. The 3 fragments will lose synchronization. The sisters will once again become 3 cursed loners. Everything will go back to 0. Celeste said there must be another way. Dan said there is no other way. The days passed. The 8th, the 9th, 10. Dan was working, not just with his hands, with his mind. He was taking the system apart piece by piece. Every day after work in the village, he would sit by the stove and close his eyes. The system would lay out the data, parameters, variables, connections. He was looking for a way to increase the probability of success. 41%. Not enough. The system gave hints, not direct ones, clues. The structure of the seal of oblivion has a weak spot, a node that connects the radiation to the source. If the node is severed before full activation, the power will drop from 5 kilometers to 50 meters, from 100% to 20. But the node isn't on the floor. It's down below, deep underground. It's physically impossible to reach it in 24 days. Another way is needed. Shadows. Noelle's shadow penetrates everywhere. A shadow knows no barriers. A shadow can descend along the thread of memory down to the node. A shadow can sever it. But to do that, Noelle must control her shadow. And she doesn't control it. The shadow controls her. For 4 years, the shadows have been telling her what to do. Run. Hide. Don't trust anyone. Noelle listened, because there was no one else to listen to. For Noelle to regain control, she needs to stop listening to the voices of the dead, and start speaking for herself. Dan thought about this every evening. He didn't tell Noelle. He didn't pressure her. He didn't demand anything. He did something else. He talked to her, every evening, about trivial things, about the weather, about the taste of porridge, about how Rondar the blacksmith can't sharpen his own tools even though he forges them every day, about how Horst the miller talks to the mill wheel when he thinks no one is listening. Little stories, meaningless, human. Noelle listened, at first in silence, then she began to respond, with a single word, two. Then in full sentences, she told him that when she was 13, she stole an apple from a tree in someone else's garden. It was the only crime of her life.
not counting the fact that she was born.
Dan said that stealing apples isn't a crime, but a rite of passage. Noel snorted. She didn't. She snorted. It was more than a laugh. It was the sound of a person who had remembered how to be light-hearted. The system noted it. +2 to Noel's trust score, 25. Mireille was training. Every night she would take down the tape and go out with Dan. They walked around the village. She watched. He listened. She described the lines. He recorded them. In his head, he formed a map of the village through Mireille's eyes. Every person, every mark, every line of death, every connection. The village was a living organism. The residents' marks resonated with one another, weakly, barely perceptibly, but they resonated. Families resonated more strongly, couples more strongly than singles. Dan saw a pattern. Resonance isn't magic, it's a network. Every mark is a node in the network. Every connection is an edge. The more connections, the more stable the network. The more stable the network, the harder it is for oblivion to erase the nodes. That's why the loners were the first to become empty. There was no one to hold them in place. Dan Hawk became empty because he was alone. No family, no connections, no edges in the graph. A perfect target for oblivion. But now he has 3 connections, 3 threads, 3 edges, and his seal is no longer empty. Probability of success, 47%. It's gone up by 6 points in 3 days. Lyra was changing, slowly, like a glacier retreating a millimeter a day. She still walked with her back straight and a stony face. She still scanned every corner of every room. She was still the last to fall asleep, but these were small things. She'd started leaving the door on the latch instead of the bolt. She'd started eating at the same table as Dan instead of on the bed. She'd started saying good morning to him, 2 words, every morning, like a ritual, small, but consistent. The system noted it. +1, +1, +1, 21, 22, 23, drop by drop. On the 10th day, something happened that Dan hadn't expected. He was repairing the fence behind the shed. A board had rotted and warped. He cut a new one from a piece of a beam he'd found behind the miller's house. He planed it with a knife. Dan Hawk's hands were weak. His calluses were thin. The knife slipped. A cut, a deep one, right across his palm. Blood gushed out. He cursed, not out loud, in his head, in English. Lyra came out of the shed. She saw the blood. She walked over. She took his hand. She didn't ask for permission. She just took it. She examined the cut. She pulled a strip of cloth out of her pocket, a clean one, and bandaged it, quickly, skillfully, like someone who'd done it hundreds of times, for her sisters, for herself, for people who'd been dead for a long time. She bandaged it and said nothing. Dan was silent too. She finished. She didn't let go of his hand. She stood there, holding his bandaged palm in her hands. A second, 2, 3. Then she let go. She turned around. She went into the shed. Dan stood there with his bandaged hand, watching her go. The system noted it. +3 to Lyra's trust score, 26. No words, no promises, no vows. A bandage on his palm. 3 seconds of silence. 26 out of 100. Far from 50. Far from 100. But 26 isn't 5. 26 is a woman who voluntarily touches a man for the first time in 7 years. On the evening of the 10th day, Celeste asked Dan to step outside. They stood behind the shed. Celeste drank from a flask. Her hands were shaking. She said she had to tell him something. Dan waited. Celeste said she knew Inquisitor Thorne's real name. His name isn't Valerius. His name is Kalen. Kalen Thorne. 20 years ago, he wasn't an Inquisitor. He was a scholar, a researcher of the seals, the best in the Order. He was the first to discover that the seals were not a gift from the gods, but a man-made system. He was the first to find a mention of Queen Aeschery in the Forbidden Archives. He was the first to realize that the 4 fragments could be combined, and he was the first to try to do so. 20 years ago. The other 3 bearers of the fragments, another bearer of the empty seal, another village. Kalen Thorne gathered the 4 fragments. He activated the system, and everything went wrong.
The bearer of the empty seal couldn't handle it. Achery's power was too great for a single person. The system collapsed. The village burned to the ground. The 3 bearers died. The bearer of the empty seal died. Kalen survived. But he survived changed. He saw what had happened. He saw how Achery had almost returned. He saw how the world was cracking at the seams.
And he decided that Achery must not return. Ever. He became an inquisitor. He took the name Valerius. He created a network of anchors of oblivion throughout the borderlands. He began hunting down the fragment bearers. Not out of hatred, out of fear. He believed he was saving the world. Dan listened. He asked how Celeste knew all this. Celeste answered. She said that Kalen Thorne had been her teacher at the monastery before she fled. She had been his student for 3 years. He trusted her. He told her the truth. He showed her the archives. He taught her how to use the seals. And then he ordered her to poison a friend who had accidentally seen the forbidden documents. Celeste poisoned her. Her friend didn't die, but she lost her memory. The seal of oblivion. A small dose. Celeste obeyed her teacher. And then she couldn't forgive herself. So she ran away. And for 10 years she wandered the roads. She healed others. Because she couldn't heal herself. Dan stood there and listened. The flask in Celeste's hand was empty. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. She said she knew how to kill Thorne. Not physically. Physically, he's protected. The 4th fragment makes him nearly invulnerable. But he has a weakness. He remembers. He remembers those 3 girls who died 20 years ago. He remembers their names, their faces, their voices. Oblivion erases the memories of others, but not the bearers. Thorne remembers everything, and that memory kills him every day. If, at the moment of full activation, Thorne is forced to remember what he's trying to forget, his control over the seal will falter. For a second, just one. That second will be enough for Dan to intercept the stream. Dan asked what it would take for him to remember. Celeste said 3 names. 3 girls who died 20 years ago. She knew those names. She remembered. Dan nodded. The system updated the data. Probability of success, 54%, plus 13. Celeste looked at him. Her green eyes were red from wine and sleeplessness. She asked if he would forgive her for stayed silent. Dan said there was nothing to forgive. He said everyone carries their own backlog. What matters isn't when you reveal it. What matters is that you revealed it. Celeste didn't understand the word backlog, but she understood the tone. The system noted it. Plus 5 to Celeste's trust. 20. They returned to the barn. Noelle was asleep, quietly, no screaming. 3 nights in a row. Lyra was lying on the bed. Her eyes were open. She was staring at the ceiling. Mireille was sitting by the wall, a veil over her eyes. She wasn't asleep. Dan lay on the floor, with his back to the sisters, facing the door, just like every night. 10 nights. 10 times with his back to people who could kill him. And with each passing night, it became less frightening, not because he'd gotten used to it, but because his back began to feel warmth instead of knives. 21 days until the holiday, 54%. Still a long way from 70, but closer than yesterday. The 11th day. 2 events at once. In the morning, a man arrived from Baron Exiled Wayne, not a soldier, an envoy, a young man in fine clothes and dirty boots. He'd ridden through the forest all night. His face was ashen with fatigue. He handed Dan a scroll. The scroll was brief. Baron Exiled Vane demanded payment of a tax for the maintenance of non-standard seal-bearers in the amount of 300 gold coins. Payment deadline, 5 days. In the event of non-payment, the Baron reserved the right to take 1 family member as collateral. 300 gold coins. Dan didn't have a single one. Dan's hawk had never seen a gold coin in his entire life. The messenger waited for a reply. Dan said the reply would be delivered in person. The messenger left. The second event. Noelle had disappeared. In the morning, the bed was empty. The blanket was crumpled. Noelle wasn't in the barn. She wasn't behind the barn. She wasn't by the stream. Lyra turned pale. Mireille removed the film. Her golden eyes searched. She saw Noelle's trail, faint, leading toward the forest. They ran, Dan in the lead, Lyra behind him. Mireille pointed the way. Celeste brought up the rear.
The forest was dark even in the morning. The trees stood thick and close together. Branches snagged at their clothes. The ground was wet. Footprints, dry feet, small ones, Noelle's. They found her half an hour later. She was sitting in a clearing, alone, barefoot, in a shirt. Stones lay in a circle around her, not randomly, evenly, neatly. 12 stones, like a clock. Noelle sat in the center. Her eyes were closed. Her hands rested on her knees, palms up.
The shadow beneath her didn't move. But it wasn't an ordinary shadow. It was deep, black, like a hole in the ground. And a voice rose from that shadow. Not children's voices, not the voices of her dead sisters. One voice, a woman's, an adult's, calm, ancient. The voice spoke in a language Dan didn't know. The system translated. The voice spoke. "You're the third one I've found. The first two couldn't handle it. I was too loud, too heavy, too old for young bones. But you've lasted 4 years. You're stronger than you think. Stronger than I was at your age. And now, beside you, is the one I've been waiting for 1,000 years. An empty key. My last move." Noelle replied, not with words, with a shadow. Her shadow moved. It took shape. The silhouette of a woman, tall, slender, with long hair. The silhouette turned toward Dan. Dan stood at the edge of the clearing, gazing at the shadow of Queen Aeshiri. 1,000 years. 1,000 years she had waited, hidden in the gap between light and darkness, erased from the world's memory by the seal of oblivion, but not destroyed, because a shadow cannot be destroyed. A shadow exists as long as light exists, and light is 3 fragments.
3 threads, 3 sisters. The silhouette spoke, the system translated. "You're not the first, empty key. There were 2 before you. Both came from worlds where one person can do everything, where the hero is a loner. They tried to take the power for themselves, to use the 3 fragments as weapons, and they failed. Because my power is not a weapon. My power is a contract. 3 keys, 1 signature. You understand this. You're the only one who understands, because you built such systems in your own world." Dan asked what she wanted. The silhouette replied, "I want to go back, not as I was. I was alone. I carried everything on my own, and the world crumbled beneath me. I want to return as a system, as 4 keys, not just 1. Never alone again." Dan asked what it would take. The silhouette replied, 3 things. First, the trust of all 3 sisters at level 75. Second level synchronization, a combined seal at full power. Second, the 4th fragment, oblivion. Do not destroy it. Take it, integrate it, transform it from a weapon of the church into the system's 4th key. Third, the bearer of the empty seal must accept the death of the key master. Not physical, symbolic.
The empty seal must cease to be empty. It must become the seal of the 4th key, the seal of memory, the antithesis of oblivion. To do this, Dan must pass through the circle of oblivion, enter it, lose everything, and emerge on the other side, remembering, the probability of survival depends on the trust level. At 75 for all 3, 68%. At 100 for all 3, 93. Dan stood there and did the math. 68 is better than 41, 93 is better than 68. But to reach 100 for all 3, Lyra, 26, Mireille, 31, Noelle, 25. A long way to go. 21 days. A long way off. Aeshiri's silhouette began to fade. Her voice grew quiet. The last thing she said, "Don't rush. Trust isn't built quickly. It's built the right way. I've waited 1,000 years. I'll wait another 21 days. The shadow returned to its place. Noelle opened her eyes. She looked at Dan, then at her sisters. She said she'd heard everything, that the queen had spoken through her but hadn't controlled her, that she herself had chosen this clearing.
She herself had laid out the stones.
She herself had called out to the voice. For the first time in 4 years, it wasn't the shadow that decided for her. She decided for the shadow. The system recorded it. +5 to Noelle's trust score, 30. +2 for Lyra, 28. +2 for Mireille, 33. They returned to the barn, in silence. Everyone was thinking. Dan was thinking about the probabilities. Lyra thought about how, for the first time in 3 years, she had a plan instead of just running away. Mireille thought about how, for the first time, a vision of the future had given her hope instead of terror. Noelle thought about how the voices in the shadows had fallen silent, and in the silence, she heard her own breathing. For the first time in 4 years, she could hear herself. That evening, Dan took out the Baron's scroll. 300 gold pieces, 5 days. He looked at Celeste. She knew these places. She knew the Baron. Baron Exiled Wayne, 50 years old, greedy, clever, not evil by nature, but corrupt to the core. Celeste said that Wayne had a problem he hadn't been able to solve for 10 years. In the basement of his castle stood a mechanism, a locked safe, his father's legacy.
The old Baron had died without leaving a key. For 10 years, Exiled had been hiring craftsmen. The 12th day, Dan was walking to the neighboring village, a 2-hour walk through the forest, alone. Lyra wanted to go with him. He said no. Someone had to guard the barn. Gregor fell silent but didn't give up. Rats go quiet before they bite. Lyra didn't argue. She gave him a knife. Her own. The very one. The one that had been under her pillow the first night. The one that had been on the table the second. The one she sharpened every evening. She gave it to Dan. Without a word. Dan took it. Without a word. The system noted it. +2 to Lyra's trust score. 30. She'd given him her weapon. The thing that had stood between her and the world for 3 years. She'd given it to the only man she'd allowed to stand on her side. The village was called Cross Bridge, larger than Hawk Hollow. 100 people. A market on Saturdays. A blacksmith shop on the outskirts. Smoke from the chimney. The clang of metal. Dan approached. Blacksmith so. Broad-shouldered. Bearded. He looked like Rondar but older and meaner. He stood at the anvil, striking the red-hot iron with a hammer.
A girl stood nearby, short, dark hair tied in a bun, an apron over her dress, her hands covered in soot. She held the workpiece with tongs and turned it with every blow from her father. Precisely, without hesitation, like a metronome. Hana So. Dan approached the smithy. So saw him and frowned. A stranger, a farmhand from the neighboring village, the very one who'd married the 3 damned ones. Rumors spread fast. So said he didn't talk to the dead. Dan said he wasn't dead. He was the husband of the 3 seals and head of the Hawk household. So snorted. The House of Hawk, a shack made of rotten planks. Dan said he had a business proposal. So said he had no business with the dead. Hana stood behind her father. She looked at Dan, not with fear, but with curiosity. Cautious curiosity, like someone who wants to get closer but knows she can't. Dan noticed a bruise on her wrist. Fresh, not from work, from a hand. Someone's hand had gripped her wrist, tightly. Dan didn't ask. Not now. He laid out his proposal. He needed a craftsman who had a feel for mechanisms, someone who could determine the position of a disc by touch. A 1-day job. Payment, 10 gold pieces. So fell silent.
10 gold pieces was a month's income for the smithy, but he shook his head. Hannah wouldn't go anywhere with a stranger. He wouldn't let his daughter go. Dan asked why, so didn't answer. Hannah lowered her eyes. Dan understood. Her body remembered fragments, conversations at the market, rumors.
The blacksmith So owed Baron Wayne a large sum, for iron, for coal, for the right to run the smithy. The debt had been growing for 3 years. The Baron offered a deal. The debt would be forgiven in exchange for Hannah marrying the Baron's estate manager, a man who was 52 years old. 3 ex-wives. All had died under mysterious circumstances. So agreed. Because he had no choice. Hannah knew. The bruise on her wrist was from the estate manager. He'd come by yesterday. He'd looked at the bride. He grabbed her hand. He inspected the merchandise. Dan stood by the forge and felt the seal of his stepfather pulsing against his chest. 15% chance of success. Luck doesn't decide everything. But it shifts things. It guides. It nudges. He told So that he could write off his debt. So stared at him. Dan explained. Baron Vane is demanding 300 gold pieces from the House of Hawk.
Dan intends to offer the Baron a deal, to open his father's safe, instead of money. If the Baron agrees, Dan will include the cancellation of blacksmith So's debt in the terms of the deal. In return, Hannah will open the lock. So was silent for a long time. Then he asked why. Why should Dan help a stranger's blacksmith from a stranger's village? Dan told the truth. He said he needed a master craftsman, and Hannah was the best in the area. He said that the bruise on his daughter's arm was not something an 18-year-old should have to endure. He said that every key in the system had to be free, otherwise, the entire system was vulnerable. So didn't understand the last sentence, but he understood the first 2. He looked at his daughter. Hannah was looking at Dan. For the first time, someone had noticed the bruise. For the first time, someone called it what it was. So he nodded. Dan left. The way back through the forest. 2 hours. He thought. The plan was getting more complicated. The deal with the Baron, opening the safe, writing off the debt, bringing Hannah into the house. Each step led to the next, like in a distributed system where every transaction depends on the previous one.
One mistake, and a cascading failure. He returned to Hawk Hollow by evening. Lyra was waiting in the doorway. She didn't ask how it went. She handed him a bowl of porridge. Hot. She'd cooked it twice. The first batch had cooled down. She'd cooked it again so it would be hot when he got home. Dan took the bowl. He ate standing in the doorway. Porridge with salt and Celesta's herbs. Hot. The first hot meal anyone had ever cooked just for him, in both of his lives. The system didn't register anything. The numbers didn't change. Not everything can be measured by numbers. Some things just are. Hot porridge on the threshold. The next day, the 13th, Dan sent a message to the Baron via the miller Horst's messenger. Horst delivered flour to the castle every week. He agreed to deliver the scroll in exchange for a sack of flour. Dan wrote it. He wrote that the head of the Hawk household was offering Baron Exiled Vane a deal. In exchange for 300 gold pieces, the House of Hawk would open the mechanical safe in the castle's basement.
The terms: a tax exemption on non-standard media, the cancellation of blacksmith So's debt from Crossbridge, and access to the safe's contents for both parties. The reply arrived 2 days later, the 14th day. A messenger in fine clothes and dirty boots, the same guy. A scroll bearing the Baron's seal. The Baron agrees, with one addition. If the safe isn't opened within 1 day, House Hawk will pay 500 gold pieces instead of 300, or hand over 1 family member as collateral. Dan looked at the number, 500, instead of 300. The Baron had raised the stakes. He knew the safe wouldn't open. No one had been able to in 10 years. He figured that a farmhand from the barn certainly wouldn't be able to either, and that in a day's time he'd have either 500 gold pieces or one of the sisters as collateral. Dan smiled. Not fun. Sharp, like a man who sees a trap and walks into it anyway, because a trap within a trap works both ways. He wrote his reply. Agreed. Date: in 3 days. The 17th day since the start. The 13th day before the holiday. 3 days to prepare. He went to Crossbridge to see Hannah. The blacksmith, So, stood at the anvil. Hannah stood beside him, a bag of tools slung over her shoulder, ready. So looked at his daughter, then at Dan. He said one sentence. He said that if anything happened to Hannah, something happened, he would heat his best hammer until it glowed red hot and drive it into Dan's skull. Dan said that was fair. It was becoming a habit. People around him were threatening him with death, and the system counted it as progress. They walked back. Hannah walked in silence. She stuttered on every third word when she tried to speak, but she wasn't trying. She was silent. She looked at the road, at the forest, at the sky. She had never gone more than 2 kilometers from her father's blacksmith shop. The world beyond those 2 kilometers was new to her, vast, frightening, beautiful. They arrived in Hawk Hollow. Hannah saw a barn. 3 sisters stood in the doorway, Celeste with a flask. She stopped. Her hands clenched the straps of her bag. Her knuckles were white. Lyra stepped forward. She looked at Hannah, then at Dan. She asked who it was. Dan said it was the master who would open the Baron's safe. Lyra looked at Hannah again. 18 years old. She stutters. A bruise on her wrist. Lyra had seen people like that. She used to be like that herself. Not on the outside, on the inside. A person the world had chewed up and spit out. Lyra nodded. She said one word. "Come in." Hannah stepped inside. Noelle looked at her from under the blanket. Mireille smiled, a small, quiet smile. Celeste handed her a mug of hot herbal tea. Hannah took the mug with both hands. She drank in small sips. Her hands stopped shaking. The system registered a new participant, Hannah So. Day 15, halfway through the term. Dan stood in front of Baron Wayne's castle. Gray walls, 3 towers, a moat of murky water. The drawbridge was down, guards at the gate, 2 soldiers in chainmail. They looked at Dan as if he were a cockroach who'd come to an audience with the king. Hannah stood behind him, a bag of tools slung over her shoulder, her hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. She didn't stutter. She remained silent. Silence was her armor. Lyra walked third. She refused to stay in the barn. She said that if Dan was going to see the Baron, she was going with him. Not for protection, to observe. She wanted to see the Baron. She wanted to understand who he was. She wanted to know who they were dealing with. Mireille stayed in the barn with Noelle and Celeste. 3 people under one roof. 3 people at the castle, half and half. The guards let them through. The Baron was waiting. A hall on the first floor, a long table, a fireplace, deer heads on the walls. Baron Exiled Vane sat in an armchair by the fireplace. 50 years old, heavy set, but not flabby. You could feel the muscles beneath the fat. A former soldier turned merchant, intelligent eyes, piercing. He sized up everyone who entered. He sized up Dan in 3 seconds. A farmhand, skinny, poor, nothing special. He took longer to size up Lyra. White hair, straight back, cold eyes, dangerous. He didn't size up Khan at all. A girl with a sack, not worth his attention. That was his first mistake. The Baron said the terms were simple. The basement, the safe, 1 day. If they opened it, the debt would be written off and the tax cancelled. If not, 500 gold pieces or collateral. He looked at Lyra when he said the word collateral. Lyra didn't move. Her face was like stone. The Baron smiled. He thought she was afraid. She wasn't afraid. She was memorizing the layout of the rooms.
The number of guards, the windows, the doors, the exits, a habit. They went down into the basement. Stone steps, dampness, torches on the walls. The cellar was large, a vaulted ceiling, barrels of wine, sacks of grain, and at the far end, against the wall, a safe. Not a safe as Daniel understood it, not a metal box with a combination lock, a stone monolith, 2 meters tall, 1.5 meters wide, carved from a single piece of granite. The front panel, 3 discs, each the size of a plate, made of stone, with symbols along the edge, 12 symbols on each, runes, an ancient language, the Veldgard system. Dan stepped closer. He touched the stone, cold, smooth, perfectly crafted. This wasn't the work of an ordinary stonemason. It was the work of a master who knew what he was doing. Hannah approached. She set the bag on the floor. She took out her tools, thin rods, probes, and a small mirror on a long handle. She crouched down in front of the safe. She placed her palms on the first disc. She closed her eyes. Her fingers began to move. Slowly, carefully, she rotated the disc by a millimeter at a time. She paused. She listened, not with her ears, but with her fingers. Each stone responded differently. Each symbol produced a microscopic vibration when turned, a difference an ordinary person wouldn't feel. But Hannah could feel it. At the horn, she became a different person. Here, too, the shy girl had vanished. Only the master remained. Eyes closed, breathing steady, fingers like sensors. Dan stood nearby and said nothing. He didn't interfere. Lyra stood by the door, watching. The Baron had stayed upstairs. His manager stood in the corner of the basement. That very same man, 52 years old, small eyes, fat fingers. He was looking at Hannah, not at the safe, at Hannah, as if she were property that had been temporarily lent to him. Lyra noticed his gaze. Dan noticed Lyra's gaze. She was looking at the manager the way a she-wolf looks at a jackal that has come too close to her pups. Not fear, not anger, calculation. Hannah worked for an hour. The first disc clicked. It fell into place. The manager flinched. Hannah moved on to the second one. Her fingers on the stone. A slow rotation, millimeter by millimeter. The second hour. The second click. 2 out of 3. The manager ran upstairs to report to the Baron. Lyra approached Dan. She said quietly.
She said the manager was a problem. If the safe opened and So's debt were written off, Hannah would be freed from the marriage. But the manager wouldn't let her go. He'd paid for her. Not to the Baron, to the blacksmith. A direct deal. A person for money. Writing off the Baron's debt doesn't cancel the deal between the manager and the blacksmith. Dan looked at her. He hadn't thought of that. He'd been thinking about numbers, about locks, about probabilities. He'd forgotten about people. Lyra hadn't forgotten about people. For 3 years, she'd been a shield between the sisters and the world. She knew how deals between predators worked. Dan asked what to do. Lyra said there would be weapons and documents in the safe. Celeste had mentioned this. A dossier on the Inquisition. If the dossier contained anything incriminating against the administrator, the deal with the blacksmith would be nullified. If not, they'd need another leverage point. Dan nodded. Hannah was working on the 3rd disc, the 3rd hour, the 4th. Her fingers were red from the cold stone. She didn't stop. She didn't complain. She didn't say a word. Sweat on her forehead, her lip bitten. Absolute concentration.
The 5th hour. A click. The 3rd disc had been removed. 3 out of 3. Silence. Then a rumble, low, deep, as if the stone had sighed. The front wall of the safe slowly slid down, centimeter by centimeter. Dust swirled in clouds. The light from the torches slipped inside. Dan stepped forward. Inside the safe were 3 items. First, a sword, an old one. The blade was dark. The hilt was wrapped in leather. Runes were engraved on the blade, the same runes as on the discs. Second, a box, wooden, with iron corners, closed, but without a lock, just closed. Dan opened it. Inside was a stack of papers, thick, yellowed, old, records, dates, names, amounts, diagrams, files. Third item, a ring, silver, with an engraved symbol, 3 threads woven into a knot. Dan froze. He'd seen that symbol before. on his own chest. One of the 3 threads that had appeared after synchronization. The same pattern, the same knot. The old baron's ring was a seal, not a church seal, an ancient one. A seal from the time of Aeschery. Baron Wayne's father was a keeper, not a clergyman, not an inquisitor, a keeper of memory, one of those who hid the truth from the church. Baron Exiled Wayne didn't know.
He thought his father had hidden gold. He had spent 10 years searching for his inheritance. But the inheritance wasn't gold. It was more dangerous than gold. Dan took the file. He took the ring. He left the sword behind. The Baron came downstairs. He saw the open safe. He saw the sword. He grabbed it. He turned it over in his hands. He frowned. "Where's the gold?" Dan pointed to the box. He said there were documents inside. Some for the Baron, some for House Hawk. Just as they'd agreed. Both sides would have access to the contents. The Baron grabbed the box. He pulled out the papers. He read them. His expression changed. First, disappointment. The days sped by. The 16th, the 17th, the 18th. 14 days until the holiday. 13, 12. Dan worked on each one. Every day was a brick. Every night was mortar. He was building. Not walls. Not a roof. Bonds. Hannah stayed in Hawk Hollow. Her father arrived on the 3rd day. He stood by the shed. He looked at his daughter. Hannah stood in the doorway. No bruise. Tools in her hands. She was fixing the door hinge. All by herself. Without being told. Because the door creaked and kept Noel from sleeping.
He watched and said nothing. Then he left.
He didn't take his daughter away. He understood. Not with his mind, with something deeper. That for the first time in 18 years, his daughter was standing in the doorway and wasn't afraid. Hannah began to forge. Dan found her a spot. Behind the shed, stones instead of a forge, firewood instead of coal. Rough, primitive, but Hannah worked. She forged hooks, staples, hinges, nails, little things that Dan traded in the village for food. The Hawk household's economy began to function. Dan repaired things. Hannah forged. Celeste healed. 3 sources of income, 3 trades, 3 reasons for the village to tolerate 4 outcasts and 2 strangers under one roof. Gregor fell completely silent. After Cassian's visit and after news of the Baron's safe spread throughout the district, the village headman stopped leaving the house. He was afraid. Not of Dan, of the records, of Cassian's notebook, of the files from the safe. Gregor was part of the Baron's scheme, a minor link, a supplier of empty bottles. He sent farmhands with expired seals to the Baron's castle. The Baron sold them on. Gregor got a cut. Now that share lay in a box in Dan's barn.
Black on yellow, names, dates, amounts. Trust was growing. Every day, drop by drop. 1 lira, 35, 37, 39, 40. She began talking with Dan in the evenings. Not about plans, not about strategy. About herself. About how, at 15, she'd fallen in love with the baker's son from a mountain village. How he'd take her for rides on his horse. How he laughed. How the horse bolted and he fell and broke his neck. How everyone said it was Lyra's curse, the bringer of misfortune, the opposite of luck. She kills those she loves. Lyra told this in an even voice. No tears. No tremor, like a report, like an autopsy report. Dan listened. Then he said the horse hadn't bolted because of a curse. Horses bolt for dozens of reasons. It got spooked. A nail in the horseshoe. A wasp. Anything. The seal of fortune manipulates probabilities. Plus 15% within a 10-meter radius. That means 85% of events happen normally. The horse could have bolted even without the seal. Lyra was silent. Then she said she knew. She had always known. But it was easier to believe in a curse than to accept that the world was simply cruel for no reason. The system noted it. Plus 4, 44, Mireille, 33, 36, 39, 42. She began showing Dan visions, not through words, directly. She would touch his hand, and he would see what she saw. Lines, threads, death and life intertwined into a single tangle. It was terrifying and beautiful. Like code that works, but you don't understand how. She showed him the line of the widow Mirren. Short, dull. This winter. Dan asked if it could be changed. Mireille said she didn't know. She'd never tried. The lines had always been a verdict, not a tool. Dan said that any verdict is a bug in the system, and bugs can be fixed. Mireille looked at him, golden eyes without the film. Night, moonlight. She said he was the first person to look at death and see not an end but an error in the code. +5, 47, Noel, 30, 33, 35, 38. She began talking aloud to the shadows, in front of everyone, without hiding. Before, she used to whisper, in the corner, under the blanket. The 25th day, 5 days until the holiday. A dove flew in that morning, small, gray, with a note tied to its leg. Dan took the note. Cassian's handwriting, neat, small, meticulous.
Senior Inquisitor Valerius Thorn had left the provincial capital. Arrival in 5 days. Escort, 12 soldiers of the order, 1 assistant. Cassian. Cassian had sent a warning, not out of duty, by choice. Dan reread the note. Cassian didn't have to write. He could have waited and arrived with Thorn as expected, but he chose to warn him. Why? Dan recalled the inspection, how Cassian had looked at the seals, how his hand holding the lens had trembled. He had seen what he wasn't supposed to see, the 4 elements of a single system, harmony, and that harmony had made him doubt. Not Dan. The order, the system he had served for 23 years, a small crack, but cracks bring down dams. 5 days. Dan gathered everyone, 6 people. The plan hadn't changed, but the schedule had tightened. 5 days to prepare. Every hour counted. Noelle trained. Every night she would go to the abandoned house, not inside, nearby. She sat on the ground, closed her eyes, sent her shadow downward, into the earth, following the thread of memory to the knot. Every night she went deeper. The first night, 3 meters. The voices of the dead were deafening. I don't remember. I don't remember. I don't remember. She came back with blood running from her nose. The second night, 7 meters. The voices were quieter. She was getting used to it, like a diver gets used to the pressure. The third night, 15 meters. She found the first traces of the knot, a pulsation, a rhythm, like the heartbeat of something enormous and sleeping. The fourth night, 20 meters. She touched the knot, the thread between the emitter and the source, thick, pulsating, hot. Noelle's shadow wrapped around her and tugged. The thread didn't give way, but it wavered. The power reading on the floor of the house flickered. 3%, 2.5, 3 again. A fluctuation. So it's possible. So at the moment of full activation, when all the energy surges through the thread, Noelle will be able to cut it. Not before, not after, at that exact moment. When the thread is stretched to its limit, when the pressure is at breaking point. Noelle returned every night, exhausted. She'd collapse onto the bed. She'd fall asleep instantly. The shadows under the bed lay still. They were tired too. The system recorded +2, +3, +1. Noelle, 48, 49, 50. The 50 threshold. The Queen's shadow spoke directly to Dan for the first time. It happened on the 4th night. Noelle was asleep. Dan was sitting by the stove. A shadow under the bed stirred. It reached out toward him. It wrapped itself around his legs. Cold. Then warmth. Then a voice. Not in his head, in the air. Quiet. Feminine. Ancient. The voice of Queen Ashiri. She said, "My king." Dan said he wasn't a king. She said a king isn't the one who sits on the throne. A king is the one who holds the keys and shares them. She said she could see through Noelle's shadow. She could see the house, 6 people, the fire in the stove, the smell of porridge. She said she hadn't seen a home in 1,000 years. Only darkness, only silence, only oblivion, which was devouring her bit by bit. She had lost her face. She lost her name. She lost everything except one thing. She remembered why she created the system, not for power, so that no one would have to bear it all alone. Dan listened.
He asked what would happen when she returned. Aishiri fell silent. Then she told the truth. She won't return. Not as a person. She's lost too much. 1,000 years of oblivion do not pass without a trace.
She would return as a system, as code, as an architecture that would allow people to build connections again. Not her legacy. The seals would become what they once were, a tool for connection, not control. But for that to happen, the fourth fragment must be integrated. Oblivion must become memory. Destruction must become a foundation. She said Dan would do it. Not because he's a hero, because he's an engineer. He builds systems. It's his nature. In any world, in any body. The shadow released his legs. The voice fell silent. Dan sat and stared at the fire. Lyra wasn't asleep. She heard everything. She lay on the bed with her eyes open, listening to the conversation between the man and the 1,000-year-old shadow. She said it quietly. She said, Dan, for the first time. Not husband, not laborer, not a stranger. Dan. His name, from her mouth. +6 to trust. 55. 50. The threshold crossed. For the first time, she asked him to protect her sisters instead of protecting them herself. She said, protect them, please. Not an order, a request. The first request in 3 years. Dan said, we'll protect them together. Lyra closed her eyes. A tear ran down her cheek.
Just one. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall.
The 28th day. 2 days. Dan stood in the doorway of the barn and looked out at the road. Somewhere beyond the forest, traveling down that road, was a man who had spent 20 years burning people to save the world from the nightmare he himself had created. Valerius Thorn. Kalen. The scientist who became an executioner, the keeper of oblivion. The man who remembered what he erased from others. Dan clenched his fists. 28 days ago, he had been lying face down in the mud in the square, alone, with an empty seal, with empty hands, with an empty name. Now, behind him, there were 6 people, 3 threads on his chest, 2 allies in the village, a dossier on the Baron, Aishiri's silver ring in his pocket, and a 75% chance of success. Not 100, but 75. 3/4. Dan smirked. In his former life, 3/4 was a passing grade, enough to stay in the project, enough to pass the code review, enough to gain access to production. Here, 3/4 meant the lives of 6 people, and everyone sleeping in the houses around them. 40 people who hated him, who spat in his face, who threw stones at his wife. They didn't know that in 2 days, the laborer they'd considered dead would stand between them and oblivion. And that was normal. That was right. Protection doesn't require gratitude. Protection requires only a decision. He made that decision 28 days ago when he pulled the scrolls out of the mud. The rest was just engineering. The 30th day, the feast of purification. The morning was clear. For the first time in a month, the clouds parted and the sun bathed the village in yellow light, as if the world had decided to watch what would happen. Thorn arrived at dawn, a black horse, a black cloak, 12 soldiers in chainmail, Cassian half a step behind, with a book. The village had gathered in the square, all 40 people. Gregor stood by his house, sober, pale. He didn't go out to the square. He stood by the window and watched through the glass, a rat that senses a trap. Thorn dismounted. Dan saw him for the first time. Tall, thin, a face like an axe, narrow, sharp, gray eyes, not angry, tired. The eyes of a man who hasn't slept properly in 20 years, because every night he sees the faces of the 3 girls he didn't save. Something was glowing on his chest under his cloak. Dimly. Blue. The 4th seal. the seal of oblivion. He was carrying it on him. Not in the abandoned house. On him. The house was the anchor, the transmitter. Thorn was the source. Dan had recalculated. The plan had changed. The node wasn't in the ground. The node was in Thorn. The thread ran from Thorn to the anchor in the house, and from the anchor into the ground. 3 elements of a single chain: source, transmitter, repository. To bring down the system, you need to break the chain at either of the 2 points. Noel can cut the thread between the anchor and the repository. That will reduce the power, but it won't eliminate it entirely. The source will remain. Thorn will remain. You need to cut both threads simultaneously. Noel is downstairs, and someone is here, upstairs, next to Thorn. Someone with an empty seal that absorbs. Dan. Thorn read the verdict in the square, loudly, steadily, without emotion. The charges: 3 bearers of non-standard seals, 1 bearer of an empty seal. Suspected of heresy. Suspected of ties to a forbidden entity known as the Weaver.
By the law of the Order of the 3 Faces, the accused are subject to purification by fire. The pyre has already been built. In the square, firewood, straw, a post, ropes. The crowd was silent. They weren't shouting. They weren't screaming, "Burn her," like they had a month ago. They were silent. Something had changed in 30 days. Not in Dane. In the village. Olaf the baker stood in the front row. His hands were clenched. He looked at the pyre and didn't smile. Horst the miller stood beside him. His face was grim. Rondar the blacksmith stood at the edge of the crowd. His arms were crossed. Mirren the widow sat on a bench, small, hunched over. She was looking at Dan, the man who had repaired her roof and given her a blanket, and to whom she had given a blanket in return. The village was silent. A month ago, they had wanted to burn the 4 of them. Now they were silent, not out of courage, but out of doubt. A small, quiet doubt, but one that was enough. Dan stepped forward. He said, "I contest the charge by virtue of the right of the husband of the 3 seals." Thorn fell silent, mid-sentence, mouth agape. He looked at Dan. For the first time, truly, gray eyes, tired.
And deep inside, something stirred. Fear, not of Dan, of the words. Husband of the 3 seals. An ancient law, a law from the time of Ashiri, a law the church hadn't repealed because it had forgotten about it, because the seal of oblivion had erased it from everyone's memory except those who remembered, except the Vesper clan, except Lyra. She told Dan about it on the 22nd day, the threshold of 20. She shared a fragment of the story of her own accord. The story she shared was not about a boy on a horse. It was about the law, about the right of the husband of the 3 seals to challenge any accusation by the order through a ritual of confirmation. The ritual is simple. The husband presents the 3 seals. The 3 seals resonate with his void. The resonance confirms that it is a lineage, not a curse. If the resonance is pure, the accusation is dropped. According to Ashiri's own law, a law that the church itself incorporated into its charter 1,000 years ago, because, at the time, it seemed safe. Who will gather the 3 fragments? Who will find the empty seal? It's impossible. Dan presented the 3 seals: Lyra, Mireille, Noel. The 3 sisters stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, not behind him, not on either side, in a line. 4 of them. 4 seals, 1 resonance. Dan activated the combined seal. 3 threads on his chest flared up, white, silver, dark. The empty circle on his chest filled with a pattern, 3 threads woven into a knot. The same symbol as on the ring from the safe. The same symbol that had burned on Ashiri's husband's chest 1,000 years ago. The resonance spread like a wave, invisible but palpable. Everyone in the square felt it. Warmth, light, like the first ray of sunlight after winter.
The resident seals responded, quietly, barely perceptibly, like strings that resonate when a chord is struck nearby. Thorn turned pale. He felt the resonance. The fourth seal on his chest began to vibrate. Oblivion versus memory. Erasure versus connection. Two poles of the same system. Thorn raised his hand. The soldiers stepped forward. Thorn said that the confirmation ritual required verification by the senior inquisitor, that he would conduct the verification personally, that all four must accompany him to the place of purification, to an abandoned house. Dan nodded.
He knew that Thorn would transport everything to the house, to the anchor, to the fourth seal, where oblivion was at its strongest. It was a trap, for both of them. Thorn thought that inside the house, his seal would crush Dan's resonance. Dan knew that Noel was waiting underground in the house. 5 people were walking toward the abandoned house: Dan, Lyra, Myre, Thorn, and Cassian. Noel had left earlier, before dawn. She was already down below, 20 meters deep. A shadow coiled around the thread connecting the anchor to the vault. She was waiting. Celeste stood at the edge of the square, in the crowd, unnoticed. She was waiting for her moment. 3 names, 1 second. Hannah stood at the entrance to the abandoned house, with Rondar the blacksmith's hammer. A heavy one. She held it with both hands. Lightly, like a feather. At the horn, she was a different person. Here, too. They entered. Thorn first. Dan behind him. Lyra and Myre on either side. Cassian by the door. The circle on the floor glowed brighter than before. Blue light, cold. The symbol spun. Faster. Activation was approaching. Thorn stood before the circle. He unfastened his cloak.
On his chest was the seal of oblivion. Complete. Alive. Pulsating. 3 concentric circles. Inside, a circle without a pattern. Emptiness. The anti-seal. A mirror image of Dan's empty seal. 2 sides of the same coin. Memory and oblivion. Connection and erasure. Thorn looked at Dan. He said he knew. He said that 20 years ago he had seen 3 girls burn because the previous bearer of the empty seal had failed. He said he wouldn't let that happen again. He said he would burn the entire continent if necessary, so that Ashiri wouldn't return. Dan said that Ashiri wouldn't return, not as a person, as a system. Thorn didn't hear him, or didn't want to hear him. He activated the seal. Full power. A blue light flooded the room. The cold hit like a wall. The circle on the floor howled. The symbols swirled. The thread between Thorn and the anchor tightened. The thread between the anchor and the vault tightened. The power was rising. 10%. 20. 30. Dan felt oblivion pressing down on him, on his memory, on his consciousness, on his connections. The 3 threads across his chest trembled. The system screamed warnings. 40%. 50. Myre grabbed Dan's hand.
A premonition, 3 seconds of the future. She showed him. Thorn would raise the power to 100. The thread would snap. An explosion. White light. Everyone in the room will lose their seals. Forever. 3 seconds. Dan shouted. Now! Celeste! Celeste's voice from behind the wall. Loud, clear, sober. 3 names. Arena, Valia, Solveig. Thorn froze. 60%. The power stopped. 3 names. 3 girls. 20 years old. He remembered. The seal of oblivion erased everyone's memory, but not his. He remembered every face, every voice, every scream. Arena, who loved to sing. Valia, who was afraid of spiders. Solveig, who laughed so hard the windows rattled. 3 girls he had killed while trying to save the world. Thorn closed his eyes.
1 second. The power wavered. 60. 55. Control slipped away. For a second, Dan stepped into the circle. The threads on his chest flared. All three. White, silver, dark. The empty seal opened. A web. Hundreds of lines. Thousands. The root key. He accepted the flow of oblivion. All of it. Into himself. Through the empty seal. Through the 3 threads. Through the 3 fragments. Pain. Not physical. Deeper. Memory was slipping away.
His memory, Seattle, the office, the keyboard, the code, everything was dissolving. Oblivion was devouring his past. Pieces were falling away like plaster from the ceiling. His boss's name, forgotten. His apartment address, forgotten. The taste of coffee, forgotten. The color of the office walls, forgotten. All at once. Down below, 20 meters underground. Noel surged forward. A shadow severed the thread between the anchor and the vault. A clean break, like scissors cutting a thread. The power plummeted. 60, 30, 15. Thorne screamed, not from pain, from horror. He felt his seal losing its source, how oblivion was thrashing in the void, how the circle on the floor was fading. Dan stood in the center of the circle. Oblivion was still flowing through him, weaker, quieter, but it was flowing. He was losing his memory, piece by piece. Code, forgotten. Programming languages, forgotten. Algorithms, forgotten. Multi-signature. He stopped. No, not that. That's the one thing he can't forget, because it's not just knowledge, it's a principle. 1 key is vulnerable. 3 keys are security. 4 keys are divided power. It's not memory. It's him. It's what makes him Daniel. Oblivion struck again, trying to erase the last bit, and the 3 threads on his chest responded. He wasn't alone. Lyra, her hand on his shoulder. 15% chance. The odds had shifted. In his favor. Murray, her hand on his hand. Foresight. She saw the path. In 2 seconds, oblivion would run dry. 2 seconds. Hold on. Noel, from below, through the shadow, through the severed thread. The voices of the dead were screaming his name. Dan. 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 Don't run. Hang in there. 2 seconds. 1. Oblivion had faded. The circle on the floor went out. The symbols stopped. Silence. Dawn over Hawk Hollow. The first dawn after the purge that never was. The bonfire in the square had been taken down during the night. Not Dan, not the sisters, the villagers. Olaf the baker was the first to arrive. He silently pulled out the firewood. Horst the miller was the second to arrive. The widow Mirren brought water and doused the embers. Rondar the blacksmith took the pole and carried it back to his smithy, silently, without explanation. By morning, there was an empty spot in the square, a black circle from the bonfire on ground, and nothing else. Gregor had disappeared during the night. He'd packed his things, taken his horse, riding away. No one knew where, and no one asked. His house stood empty. The door was open. A half-empty jug and a crust of bread remained on the table, like a rat that had fled the ship before it sank. Only the ship didn't sink. Thorne sat on the porch of an abandoned house. No cloak, no sword, no seal. Just a man in a rumpled shirt with gray eyes in which there was nothing left but weariness. Cassian stood beside him. 12 soldiers stood on the road, without orders. Their commander sat on the porch, staring into space. They didn't know what to do. Soldiers without orders are just men in chainmail. Dan approached Thorne. He sat down beside him. 2 men on the porch of a dead house. Thorne didn't look at him. He was looking at his hands. Hands without the seal. Ordinary hands.
He said he'd carried oblivion on his chest for 20 years. For 20 years it had been eating away at him from the inside, wiping him away bit by bit. Not his memory, his soul. Every time he activated the seal, a part of him was lost, a part he couldn't remember afterward. He didn't remember who he was before, didn't remember why he became a scientist,
Didn't remember what he loved, what he hated, what he dreamed of. Oblivion took everything except 3 names: Arena, Valia, Solvay. 3 names he couldn't forget, because guilt is stronger than oblivion. Dan listened. He said he understood. He said he too had lost his memory. Oblivion had devoured his former life. He didn't remember Seattle, didn't remember the office, didn't remember his boss's face, the taste of the coffee, or the color of the walls. He remembered only the principle. A single key is vulnerable. And he also remembered that he had once been a man who didn't know how to trust, and that man had died. Not from a stroke, from loneliness. Thorne looked at him, for the first time all morning, gray eyes, wet, not from tears, from something deeper. He asked what now. Dan said that now Thorne was free. No seal, no order, no command. He could leave, go anywhere, become anyone, or stay. Thorne asked why he should stay. Dan said that Thorne had been the keeper of oblivion for 20 years. He knows how it works, how it spreads, where the anchors are, how many there are, who has suffered. This knowledge is needed, not for revenge, for repair. The network of oblivion anchors throughout the borderlands must be deactivated. The gray sea must be stopped. The empty ones must be brought back. Thorne can help, if he's willing. Thorne was silent for a long time. Then he stood up. Then he nodded. He didn't say a word, but the nod was enough. Cassian approached, a book in his hand. He opened it, showed it to Dan. Entries, neat, precise. Every day of the last month, every event, every document, every discrepancy. Cassian had kept 2 sets of records, one for the Order, one for himself. His notebook contained a complete account of what had happened in Hawk Hollow, about the Seal of Oblivion, about the Resonance, about the 4 fragments, about how the Order of the 3 Faces had used Oblivion as a weapon against its own people for 1,000 years. Cassian said he would send the report to the bishop. Dan asked why. Cassian said there were people in the Order who had doubts, who saw cracks, who were asking questions. They needed facts. He would give them facts. Dan nodded. 1 crack, 1 book, 1 entry. The beginning. They returned to the barn. 6 people. 7. Thorne had come with them. He stood in the doorway. He didn't come in. Noel saw him and pressed herself against the wall. The shadow beneath her flinched. Voices hissed. Lyra stepped between Thorne and the sisters, a knife in her hand, a reflex, an old one, a reliable one. Dan placed his hand on Lyra's shoulder. He said that Thorne was no longer an inquisitor. He said that Thorne had lost the seal and 20 years of his life, and that now he was as empty as Dan had been a month ago. Lyra looked at Thorne. Thorne looked at Noelle, at the girl in whose shadow lived the queen he had spent 20 years trying to erase. He dropped to one knee. Not a bow, not submission, an admission. He said he was guilty. To her, to the sisters, to everyone he had erased. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it. He simply admitted it. Noelle looked at him for a long time. The shadow beneath her slowly subsided. The voices fell silent. Noelle said that the shadows remembered him, all those erased, all those forgotten. They live in the earth beneath the anchors and wait. They aren't angry. They're just waiting for someone to remember their names. Thorne closed his eyes. A tear ran down his cheek, the first in 20 years. Oblivion had kept him from crying. Memory brought it back. Dan stood there, watching the 7 people in the barn. At Lyra, with the knife she was slowly putting away. At Mireille, who was looking at Thorne with her golden, unclouded eyes and, for the first time, saw not the line of death, but the line of life. At Noelle, who held out a mug of water to Thorne. At Celeste, who was looking at her former teacher and, for the first time in 10 years, wasn't reaching for her flask. At Hannah, who sat in the corner quietly sharpening her hammer.
at Torn, who drank water from the hands of the girl he had wanted to erase. The system updated the data one last time. Trust, Lyra, 62. Myre, 67. Noel, 59. Not 100. Far from 100. But the system wasn't in a hurry. Trust isn't built in 30 days, it's built over a lifetime. Dan stepped out onto the porch. The sun was high in the sky. The village was alive. Smoke from the chimneys, the creak of a wagon, a rooster's crow. An ordinary morning. The first ordinary morning in 1,000 years. On the horizon, in the direction of the provincial capital, something glinted. Far away, barely noticeable.
A ray of sunlight on metal, or on glass, or on something else. Somewhere out there, the bishop was waiting. The blood audit was waiting. The tournament of clans was waiting. Yvette de Moore was waiting, with her dossier and seal. Other anchors of oblivion were waiting in other villages. Other empties who could be brought back were waiting. The throne in the capital was waiting, upon which the stone Ashiri was opening her eyes. A world was waiting to be repaired. Not saved, repaired. Like a system, like code, like a network of connections between people that had been broken for 1,000 years and now needed to be restored. Knot by knot, rib by rib, person by person. Footsteps sounded behind Dan. Lyra, she stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, not behind him, beside him. She looked toward the horizon. She asked what comes next. Dan said that next they'll stop just surviving and start building. Lyra nodded. Myre stepped onto the threshold. She stood on the other side, golden eyes unclouded. She looked at the world and, for the first time, saw not a graveyard, but a map. Noelle burst out of the shed, barefoot, a blanket draped over her shoulders. A shadow flowed calmly and quietly behind her. She stood in front of Dan. She looked up, at him. She asked, "Are we a family now?" Dan looked at her, at Lyra, at Myre, at Celeste in the doorway, at Hannah with the hammer, at Thorn with the mug in his hand. 7 people, 4 seals, 1 home. He said, "We are home now." Lyra didn't smile. She said quietly, "We are a threat now." Myre looked toward the sunrise. Her golden eyes burned. She said, 400 days! Dan looked at her. She nodded. She said that the line of his death had appeared. But it doesn't end. It goes on. Far away, beyond the horizon. She said she'd been wrong back then. On the first night, she hadn't seen the absence of a line. She'd seen a line that hadn't begun yet. Now it had begun. On Dan's chest, 4 threads were woven into a knot. White, silver, dark, blue. The empty seal was no longer empty. The seal of memory. 4 keys, 1 signature. Queen Asheri's system, restored. A voice in the shadows, Noel's, spoke the final word. Quiet, calm, satisfied. At last, and fell silent, forever. Not death, peace. 1,000 years of waiting had ended. A shadow fell upon the ground, an ordinary shadow. From an ordinary girl who stood in the doorway of an ordinary shed in an extraordinary world, which they were about to change. Dan turned toward the house, toward the 6 people waiting for him, toward the smell of porridge from the stove, to the creak of the door that Hannah had fixed yesterday, to the blanket given by the widow of Marin, to Lyra's knife on the table, to Celeste's herbs on the shelf, to Cassian's book in Thorn's pocket. Little things, human things, the building blocks of a home. He stepped inside. The door closed. Smoke curled from the chimney.
The porridge was cooking, the sun was rising.